Snow fell in slow, whispering sheets across the mountain pass, blanketing the land in white and silence. The world was hushed, the only sounds the groan of wind through the pines and the creak of leather, as Silas Jackson urged his horse forward along the narrow trail. His breath came in clouds, curling up into the cold morning air. He'd spent most of his adult life chasing gold through these hills, sifting riverbeds, digging through frozen soil, living off salt pork and hardtack. But now, 3 years after his wife Mary had died from fever, the spark that had once driven him to hunt fortune had faded. These days he mined just enough to keep food on his table and to pay the preacher his tithes in town. "Steady now," he murmured to his horse, a gray mare named Clara. The trail ahead was slick, ice glinting beneath the snow. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong, a faint cry, high and thin like the whimper of an animal. Silas pulled on the reins, his brow furrowing. He listened. The sound came again, softer this time, but distinctly human. He dismounted, boots crunching in the snow, and turned toward the dense stand of fir trees just off the trail. There, beneath the low boughs, half buried in snow, was a bundle of fabric. He knelt, brushing the snow aside with his gloved hands. A small hand emerged from the folds, impossibly tiny, and his breath caught. "Merciful heavens," he whispered. A baby, wrapped in a blanket that was already stiff with frost, and beside her, a woman, pale as death, lips blue, hair tangled with snow. Her eyes fluttered open as Silas reached for her. "Lord, don't let her die," revealing irises the color of warm earth. "Please," she rasped, voice barely a breath. "My baby." "I've got her," Silas said quickly, lifting the child into his coat, tucking her close to his chest for warmth. "Hold on, miss. Don't you close your eyes now." The woman's lips trembled in a whisper of prayer. "Neither of you are dying if I can help it," Silas muttered, already shrugging off his thick wool coat to cover the woman. "Come on now. I'm taking you to shelter." He scooped her up, light as air, and carried her to his horse. With one hand, he steadied the baby against his chest. With the other, he secured the woman across the saddle before mounting behind her. The mare grunted but obeyed as he urged her down the trail toward the cabin. The ride was brutal. The wind clawed at his face, snow whipping around them in icy sheets. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. "Stay with me," he said over the storm. "What's your name?" After a pause, he heard her whisper faintly, "Jane. Arthur." "Jane, you hold on. We're almost there." When at last the cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure with smoke curling from its chimney, Silas felt a surge of relief. He swung down from the saddle, carried Jane inside, and laid her on his bed. Then he turned to the baby, unwrapping her just enough to check her color. Her cheeks were red and her eyes closed, but her breathing was strong. "Thank the Lord," he murmured, cradling her close. He built up the fire, fed the woman warm broth by the spoonful, and prayed quietly over them both. "Lord, you've guided me to him. Please give him strength to see the night through. Let your mercy cover this roof." By morning, the worst of the storm had passed. Jane stirred, eyes opening to the dim light. Her voice was faint but clear. "The baby. She's right here," Silas said softly. He held the infant out, wrapped in clean blankets now warmed by the fire. "Strong as a colt, this one." Tears filled Jane's eyes. "You saved us." Silas shook his head. "No, ma'am, the Lord led me to you. I just did what any man ought to do." Jane tried to sit up, wincing as pain rippled through her. I didn't think anyone would find us. My wagon broke near the ridge. The driver left for help. He never came back." "You're lucky I was headed this way," Silas said. "There's no telling how long that storm would have lasted." She looked around the cabin, rough but tidy, with a small stove, a Bible on the table, and a quilt neatly folded on a chair. "This is your home?" "For now," he said. "Name's Silas Jackson. Used to work the river claims south of here. Ain't much gold left worth digging, but I get by." She nodded faintly, her eyes drifting toward the baby. "Her name is Katrina. I wasn't sure she'd live." "She's got more fight than some men I've known," Silas said with a small smile. "I reckon she'll be fine." For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind brushing against the cabin walls. Then Jane looked up, her voice trembling. "You should know. There's something I haven't told you." Silas paused, sensing the weight in her tone. "What's that?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Katrina, she isn't my husband's child." He blinked, the words sinking in. "You're not wed?" I was, she said softly. But my husband, he died months ago. Back east, I fled because his kin would have taken Katrina from me. They said she wasn't blood, that she'd be cast out. I couldn't let that happen. Silas was silent for a long time, the truth settling like snow between them. Then he nodded slowly. Ma'am, you don't owe me apology. That child's yours in every way that matters. I seen the way you hold her. Blood don't make family, love does. Jane's lips quivered as tears slipped down her cheeks. You speak kindly for a man who's known such loss. He looked away toward the fire, jaw tightening. My wife, Mary, passed 3 winters ago. Fever took her before the thaw. Since then, I've been keeping busy enough not to think too hard. Guess the Lord decided it was time I remembered what mercy looks like. A quiet peace filled the cabin then. The firelight danced on the walls, and the baby stirred softly, a faint sound of contentment escaping her lips. Over the next days, Jane grew stronger. Silas hunted and fetched water, mended clothes, and made broth from venison and wild onions. In the evenings, when the baby slept, they talked quietly about faith, loss, and the strange way Providence worked in their lives. Jane was gentle but resilient, her spirit tempered by hardship. Silas admired her courage, though he tried not to dwell too long on the warmth that stirred in his heart when she smiled. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Jane looked toward him from the fireside. Silas, she said softly, why did you stay here all alone? He hesitated. Wasn't much reason to leave. Mary's buried up on the ridge, and I didn't have it in me to start over somewhere new. She nodded slowly, her gaze tender. And now? He met her eyes across the firelight. Now I reckon the Lord might be reminding me that life ain't finished yet. The words hung in the air, warm and uncertain, but neither broke the silence that followed. Outside, the storm deepened, wrapping the little cabin in white and quiet. Inside, the crackling fire cast a glow over 3 lives. 1 weary man, 1 recovering woman, and a newborn child whose cry had called salvation out of the snow. And though neither Silas nor Jane spoke it aloud, both knew that the Lord's hand had moved between them, that what began as mercy might one day become something deeper. Morning broke slow and silver over the ridge, the snow outside glinting like crushed glass under the pale light. Inside Silas Jackson's cabin, warmth lingered, the fire still burning low in the hearth, the scent of coffee and pine smoke mixing with the soft breaths of a sleeping child. Jane Arthur stirred beneath the quilt, her body still weak but no longer trembling. She blinked awake to find Silas at the table, Bible open before him, lips moving silently in prayer. For a moment she simply watched, the steady strength of him, the bow of his head, the reverence that came so naturally to him. He looked up and offered a quiet smile. Mornin', Miss Jane. Her voice was soft, still hoarse. Mornin'. I didn't mean to sleep so long. You need rest, he said, rising to pour her a cup of hot water sweetened with honey. The storm near took your life. Ain't no shame in taking time to heal. She accepted the cup, her hands trembling as she lifted it. You've been so kind, Mr. Jackson. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You can start by calling me Silas, he said, sitting across from her. And you don't owe me a thing. The Lord sends folks across our path for a reason. Jane smiled faintly. You truly believe that? I surely do, he said, his voice firm. A man don't find a woman and a newborn in the middle of a snowstorm without the almighty will in it. She looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Then perhaps he's not finished with me yet. No, ma'am, he said gently. Not by a long shot. The baby stirred in the cradle beside the bed, a small sound of protest. Silas rose at once, lifting her with practiced hands. There now, little one, he said, his voice softening. You're mighty vocal for someone who nearly froze last week. Jane watched as he cradled Katrina, rocking her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. You handle her like a father. He paused, eyes shadowed for a moment. I once hoped to be. Jane realized she'd touched something deep and personal. Your wife, Mary, wasn't it? He nodded slowly. She couldn't bear children, tried for near 8 years, broke her heart though she never let on much, said the Lord had other plans for us. Jane's eyes softened. I'm sorry, Silas. He shrugged, though the motion carried sorrow. Wasn't her fault. The good Lord gives, he takes away, but sometimes I still hear her humming in the garden, like she's just beyond the door. A silence fell between them, gentle and full of understanding. Outside, the snow began to melt under a rare shaft of sunlight dripping softly from the roof eaves. After breakfast, Silas set about checking his traps down near the creek, leaving Jane with the fire and the baby. The cabin grew quiet save for the occasional coo from Katrina. Jane sat by the hearth, rocking gently, her gaze unfocused. It felt strange. Safety. Warmth. After months of running, of looking over her shoulder and praying each night that the Lord might shield her from those who do her harm, she was finally somewhere she could breathe. But peace was a fragile thing. Her thoughts turned to the letter she still kept hidden in her valise, the one written in a trembling hand by a dying woman who had begged Jane to take her child. The secret burned in her heart. Katrina was not her own, but the daughter of a man who'd sworn never to acknowledge her. She pressed a kiss to the baby's forehead. "You'll never know that pain, little one," she whispered. "I'll protect you, even if it costs me everything." By midday, Silas returned, snow melting from his hat brim and the scent of pine clinging to him. He carried 2 rabbits and a handful of kindling. "Got lucky down by the bend," he said, smiling as he hung his coat. "We'll eat good tonight." "Do you ever go into town?" Jane asked, curious. "Every few weeks," he said. "Supplies, mail, sometimes church when the trail ain't too bad." Her expression softened. "You still go to church after everything?" He nodded firmly. "Can't quit the Lord just 'cause life gets hard. That's when a man needs him most." Jane hesitated, then said quietly, "I'd like to attend when I'm strong enough. It's been months since I last sat through a service." Silas smiled, the kind of smile that warmed the air. "You'll be welcome there. Folks in town are decent enough. Preacher's a good man, too. Old Reverend Powell. He don't stand for gossip or backbiting, thank the Lord." Jane exhaled in quiet relief. "I've known enough of that to last a lifetime." He gave her a long, thoughtful look, as though he sensed there was more to that statement, and there was. But he didn't press. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge and the world turned gold with dusk, they shared supper at the small table. Silas bowed his head, hands folded. "Father, thank you for the mercy you've shown. Thank you for this food and the company you've sent. Keep us in your grace another night. Amen." Jane whispered, "Amen," and opened her eyes to find his gaze steady on her. Something quiet passed between them then. Not love, not yet, but a spark of kinship. 2 hearts, both weathered by loss, finding a strange comfort in each other's company. Later, after Katrina had drifted off to sleep, Jane stepped outside for the first time since the storm. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but it felt good to breathe under the open sky. She could see the town lights faintly down in the valley, just a handful of lanterns glowing through the dusk. Silas joined her, standing beside her on the porch. "Beautiful night," he said. "Yes," she murmured. "It feels peaceful." He nodded, tucking his hands in his coat pockets. "Town's about a mile and a half down that way. Miners mostly, a few families. Got a general store, a small chapel, and not much else worth bragging on." Jane smiled faintly. "Sounds just right." They stood in silence for a long while, watching the snow glint under the moonlight. Then Silas turned to her, voice low. "When the thaw comes, I'll take you both into town. The doctor there can look you over proper. You'll need a few things for the baby, too." "Thank you, Silas," she said softly. "You've done more for us than I can ever repay." He looked at her for a long moment before replying, "Sometimes the Lord asks a man to give without counting the cost. Maybe that's the lesson I needed reminding of." Her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "You speak like a man who's been through the valley and found light again." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm still walking through it, but having company sure makes the road easier." Jane looked away, heart pounding softly. She didn't understand how, in such a short time, she could feel safer near this man than she ever had in her old life. As she turned to go back inside, a faint howl echoed through the hills. A wolf, distant but near enough to remind her of the wilderness pressing in. Silas's hand rested lightly on the porch rail, close to hers. "Don't worry," he said quietly. "Nothing gets near this cabin I don't hear first." She believed him. When she finally lay down that night, with the baby asleep in the cradle and the fire low, Jane whispered a prayer. "Lord, thank you for sending this man, for saving me and her. If there's more you need me to face, give me the strength to see it through." The snow outside shimmered under moonlight, and in the next room, Silas's voice rose softly, a hymn, low and rough, the kind a man sings when he's trying to remember what hope feels like. Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. And in the small cabin nestled against the mountain, Mercy rested quietly like the snow itself, soft, unspoken, and holy. By the time the mountain snow began to melt, the days stretched longer and the creeks ran wild with the sound of spring. Icicles fell from the cabin eaves with sharp little songs, and the valley below shimmered with the promise of new growth. Jane Arthur stood at the door, shawl around her shoulders, watching the sunlight spill through the pines. Her cheeks had color again, her steps were steady now, though the memory of her illness lingered in the way she caught her breath if she moved too quickly. Inside, Silas Jackson packed the wagon with quiet efficiency. Sacks of grain, a bundle of pelts for trading, and a few jars of preserves he'd set aside for barter. "Won't be long now," he said, brushing snow dust from his hat. "You sure you're up for the ride, Jane?" She smiled faintly. "I've been up for weeks, Silas. You've kept me tucked away like a hen with a broken wing." He chuckled, the sound warm and easy. "Can't fault me for wanting to make sure you're healed proper. But if you're set on going, we'll take it slow." Katrina gurgled from her cradle, waving her little fists. Jane bent to scoop her up, swaddling her in a soft quilt. "Seems someone else is ready, too." Silas looked at them both, the woman and the child he'd found in the snow, and felt something stir deep inside, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. He quickly turned away, adjusting the reins. "All right, then, let's head for town." They set off down the trail, the wagon creaking under the weight of provisions. The air was brisk but not cruel, and the forest seemed alive again, birds returning, water rushing over stone, the scent of pine sap sharp and clean. For Jane, each sound felt like a blessing. After so many months of fear and flight, this journey, this ordinary trip into town, felt like freedom. She glanced toward Silas as he guided the team. "Do you ever tire of this life, all this solitude?" He shook his head slowly. "Not solitude. Peace. There's a difference." "I suppose there is," she said softly. "I thought I wanted peace once, but after losing everything, I realized what I really wanted was a place to belong." He turned to her, eyes gentle. "You'll find it again. Might already be closer than you think." Her breath caught, but she said nothing. The road curved downward toward the valley, where the faint shimmer of rooftops came into view. The gold town of Alder Creek. It was a small settlement by frontier standards. A few dozen buildings clustered along a muddy main street. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed faintly. The smell of horses, coal, and fresh bread mingled in the air. Silas guided the wagon to a stop outside the general store, a wide building with Powell and Son Mercantile painted in faded white letters across the front. "Welcome to Alder Creek," he said with a smile. "Might not look like much, but she's got heart." Jane smiled as she climbed down, holding Katrina close. A few townsfolk turned their heads, curious but not unkind. A pair of women nodded politely from the boardwalk. An older man tipped his hat. Inside the Mercantile, warmth and the scent of coffee greeted them. Shelves were stocked with everything from nails to molasses, bolts of fabric, lamp oil, and flour. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man with a beard gone half gray and a kindly face. "Well, if it ain't Silas Jackson," he said with a booming laugh. "Haven't seen you since before the first snow." Silas grinned. "Been snowed in most the winter, Tom. This here's Miss Jane Arthur and her little girl, Katrina. They'll be staying with me a spell." Tom Powell's brows lifted slightly, but his tone stayed friendly. "Pleasure, ma'am. Always room for new faces round here." Jane smiled politely. "Thank you, Mr. Powell." He leaned on the counter, eyes softening as he looked at the baby. "Pretty thing. You'll find good folk in Alder Creek, Miss Arthur. Not much gold left worth diggin', but plenty of good hearts left to live with." "Kind words," Jane said softly. Silas purchased flour, sugar, and a few medicines for Jane's continued recovery. As he did, Jane wandered toward a small rack of handkerchiefs, soft cotton ones embroidered with simple flowers. She fingered one absently, remembering the fine linens her late husband's family had kept, and the cold pride that had ruled that house. Here, even the simple things felt alive with meaning. As she turned, a woman about her own age approached, plain dress, friendly eyes. "Hello there," she said with a warm smile. "You're new, aren't you?" Jane nodded. "Just arrived from the mountains. I'm Jane Arthur." I'm Millie Carson, the woman said, offering her hand. My husband runs the livery. If you ever need help, don't be shy to ask. Thank you, Jane said, her heart softening at the kindness. Millie leaned a bit closer, lowering her voice. You're lucky to have Silas Jackson looking out for you. He's a good man. Been alone too long, if you ask me. Jane flushed slightly. He's been nothing but kind. Millie smiled knowingly. Kindness has a way of growing into something else if you let it. Before Jane could answer, the door opened and a gust of cold air swept in. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat dusty from the trail. His eyes were sharp, assessing. Afternoon, Miss Arthur, he said suddenly. Jane froze. She didn't know the man, yet something in his tone sent a shiver through her. I beg your pardon? He smiled thinly. Name's Pike. I used to work for your husband back east. Heard tell a woman traveling west with a child that weren't hers. Silas's hands stilled on the counter. Slowly he turned. You got business with the lady? Pike's eyes shifted toward him, calculating. Just saying she might have folks looking for her. That baby's worth more than gold to some. The room fell silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Jane's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about. Pike's lips curved. Maybe I don't, maybe I do. Silas stepped forward, his voice calm but dangerous. You best keep your tongue civil in this town, Pike. Ain't no call to stir trouble where there's none. The other man met his gaze, the air between them taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Pike shrugged. Didn't mean nothing by it, just passing along word. He turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Jane stood frozen, trembling. Silas placed a steady hand on her arm. Don't let that rattle you, Jane. Some men make a livin' stirrin' mud. Her voice shook. He knows something. Silas, if they've come for her. Hush now, he said firmly. We'll sort it out. You and that little one are safe with me. I give you my word before God. Tears filled her eyes and she nodded. I don't deserve your kindness. He looked at her gently. None of us deserve the Lord's mercy either, but he gives it anyway. Now come on. Let's get you home before the baby catches cold. As they rode back up the trail, Jane held Katrina close, heart pounding. The safety she'd begun to feel felt suddenly fragile, but as she looked toward Silas, solid, steady, the kind of man who faced storms without flinching, she found courage in his presence. If danger was coming, she would face it, and perhaps with faith and time, she might not have to face it alone. The following morning broke gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over the ridge. A soft drizzle had replaced the snow, turning the mountain path to mud. Silas Jackson leaned on the porch rail, watching mist rise from the valley below. The events of the day before replayed in his mind. Pike's words, Jane's fear, the tension that had filled the general store like a storm waiting to break. He wasn't a man given to rash anger. Life in the Gold Hills had taught him patience, how to read weather, men, and trouble before it arrived. But when he'd seen that slick-tongued stranger speak Jane's name like it was a weapon, something had risen in him he hadn't felt in years. He'd seen danger before, but this felt personal. Behind him, the cabin door opened softly. Jane stepped out, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the baby bundled against her chest. Her cheeks were pale, but her eyes steady. Couldn't sleep? Silas asked. She shook her head. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that man's voice. Silas's jaw tightened. Don't you fret. Pike's got a loose tongue, but I'll see to it he don't cause you harm. She looked up at him, voice trembling. He said there were people looking for me. If that's true, Silas, if they come here. He turned toward her, his tone low but certain. Then they'll have to get through me first. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the distant rush of the creek and the faint cry of a hawk overhead. Then Silas said quietly, Reverend Powell's holding service this morning. I think we ought to go. The Lord's house has a way of settling a troubled mind. Jane hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I think I need that. The church at Alder Creek sat at the far end of Main Street, a modest white structure with a steeple no taller than the pines behind it. The bell above the door rang clear and bright, calling the scattered souls of the valley to worship. Inside, the pews were plain, the floorboards worn smooth by years of boots and prayers. A pot-bellied stove burned near the back, filling the room with comforting warmth. As Silas and Jane entered, conversation dipped for just a moment before resuming in polite murmurs. A few familiar faces nodded in greeting. Millie Carson from the livery, old Tom Powell and his wife, and a handful of miners dressed in their Sunday coats. Jane felt their eyes on her, curious but kind. Still, a pang of self-consciousness stirred in her chest. She hadn't sat in a church since her flight from back east, hadn't dared to step into the light of worship carrying so many secrets. Reverend Powell stood at the front, tall and spare, with a beard white as cotton and eyes that seemed to see straight through a person, not in judgment, but in truth. He smiled when he saw Silas. "Brother Jackson," he said warmly, "it's good to see you this morning." "Good to be here, Reverend," Silas replied, removing his hat. "This here's Miss Jane Arthur and her daughter, Katrina." The Reverend bowed his head slightly. "Welcome, Miss Arthur. The Lord rejoices every time a new voice joins his house." Jane smiled faintly. "Thank you, Reverend." They took a seat near the back. Silas helped settle Katrina's blanket as the organ began to play, a soft, hesitant tune that filled the room with something gentle and holy. The hymn began, voices rising together in quiet harmony. "Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." Jane's lips moved with the words, her voice faint but steady. As she sang, tears filled her eyes, not of sorrow, but release. For months she had prayed in silence, always moving, always afraid. Now, for the first time, she prayed among others, under a roof where her voice could join theirs without fear. Silas sang too, his deep baritone low and sure beside her. When the hymn ended, Reverend Powell opened his Bible and began to speak. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his voice calm and rich, "the Lord does not promise us lives without trial. He promises his presence within them. Some among us carry burdens unseen, secrets, sorrows, or pasts we fear will rise against us. But hear me, there is no shadow too deep that his mercy cannot reach." Jane's hands tightened around the baby as her throat constricted. The Reverend's gaze swept the room, pausing, just briefly, on her. When we flee from our past, we forget that grace often runs faster. And when we are found, whether by a stranger's hand or a providence we can't yet understand, it's not chance. It's the hand of God saying, "You are not forgotten." Jane bowed her head, silent tears falling onto Katrina's blanket. Silas watched her quietly, moved by how deeply the words seemed to touch her. He couldn't imagine what ghosts she carried, but he knew faith when he saw it stirring back to life. When the service ended, Reverend Powell greeted the townsfolk at the door. When Jane and Silas approached, the Reverend looked kindly at her. "The Lord's hand is upon you, child. Don't let fear steal what he's given back." Jane met his eyes, voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Reverend." Outside, the clouds had broken, sunlight falling over the muddy street like a promise. Jane exhaled slowly, a small smile breaking through the worry on her face. Silas offered his arm. "You all right?" "Yes," she said softly. I think I am." They were halfway to the wagon when a voice called out from the saloon across the way. "Jackson!" Silas turned. Pike leaned against a post, hat low over his brow. "Heard the preacher talking about mercy in there. Reckon he'd have a lot to say if he knew who you were protecting." Silas's jaw hardened. "You keep your poison words to yourself." Pike smirked. "Don't get riled. I just figure a man ought to know the truth about the company he keeps. That woman's running from money, real money. I heard tell there's a man back east offering $1,000 for her return. Says she stole his child." Jane froze, color draining from her face. "That's not true," she whispered. "It's not." Silas stepped forward, fists curling. "You watch your mouth, Pike. You speak one more lie about that woman, I'll make you swallow your own teeth." Pike's grin faltered. He glanced toward the onlookers gathering nearby and spat to the side. "Ain't no skin off my back. Just don't say I didn't warn you." He walked off toward the livery, boots splashing through the mud. Silas turned back to Jane. "Don't listen to him. He's hunting trouble for coin. I've seen his kind before." But Jane's eyes were haunted, her breath shaking. "Silas, he's not entirely wrong." The words hit him like a blow. "What do you mean?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Katrina's mother was dying when she gave her to me. Her name was Elise Harlan, and her husband was a man of wealth and cruelty. He'd forbidden her to keep the child. She begged me to take her, to raise her far from that house. When I fled, I took the letter she wrote confessing everything. If her husband has learned, he'll stop at nothing." Silas stared at her, the weight of the truth settling over him. "So you risked your life to save that baby?" Jane nodded, trembling. "I couldn't let her fall into his hands." But now he sent someone, and Pike's just the start. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Silas reached out, his rough hand covering hers. You did right, Jane. The Lord knows your heart. Ain't a jury in heaven or earth that would call what you did a sin. Her lips trembled. But what if he comes here? What if? Then he'll find a man waiting on the porch with a rifle and a prayer, Silas said firmly. You're under my roof now, and I aim to see you safe. Jane met his eyes, her fear slowly giving way to something deeper. Trust, fierce and unspoken. Silas, she whispered, why are you doing this for me? He looked at her steadily. Because when the Lord sends a soul across your path in need, you don't ask why. You just thank him for the chance to do right. Her tears fell freely now, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. They climbed into the wagon, the baby sleeping between them, and started home. The road wound through the trees, sunlight breaking through the clouds like a benediction, and though danger still lingered on the horizon, so too did something new, a bond forged in faith and tested by truth, strong as the mountains around them. The wagon rattled along the muddy trail, its wooden wheels sinking into soft earth as the forest opened to the valley. A hawk circled high above the ridges, its cry echoing through the canyon. The smell of pine and wet bark filled the air, a sharp contrast to the tension still hanging between Silas and Jane. Neither spoke for several miles. Jane cradled Katrina close, her mind tumbling through Reverend Powell's words, Pike's accusation, and Silas's quiet vow of protection. Each beat of the wagon's wheels seemed to pound her fears deeper into her chest. When they reached the cabin, Silas pulled the wagon up beside the corral and helped her down. You go on inside, he said gently. Get Katrina warm. I'll see to the horse. She hesitated, watching as he untied the reins and brushed the mud from the animal's flank. The calm steadiness of his movements was strangely comforting. The world could be falling apart around him, and still Silas Jackson would move with the same quiet purpose, like a man who'd already made peace with every storm he might face. Inside the cabin, Jane settled Katrina into her cradle near the hearth. The baby gurgled softly, eyes following the flicker of the flames. Jane knelt beside her, running her fingers over the little one's downy hair. Your mama loved you, Katrina, she whispered. More than she feared anything. I pray I can love you the same way, brave and pure. A floorboard creaked. She turned to find Silas standing in the doorway, removing his hat. His eyes softened at the sight. You've got a gift with her, he said quietly. Jane smiled faintly. She gives me a reason to keep breathing. He nodded, then moved toward the window, glancing out toward the ridge. I'm going to take a ride down the east trail later. Check the fence line. Make sure there ain't been strangers nosing around. Her stomach tightened. You think Pike might... I think Pike's got a greedy heart, Silas interrupted. If there's money in your return, he won't be the last to come sniffin'. I've seen that kind before. But I aim to make this place a hard one to trespass. Jane rose and crossed the room, clutching her shawl tighter. You can't put yourself in danger because of me. He met her gaze. You think I got a choice? You and that babe are under my care now. The Lord didn't drop you in my path so I could sit by and watch harm come your way. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them hummed with the weight of unspoken things, gratitude, fear, and something gentler rising like spring beneath snow. Finally, Jane said softly, Then let me help. I can tend the fire, cook, mend whatever needs mending. I don't want to just be a burden, Silas. His expression warmed. You ain't a burden, Jane, but I won't turn down good stew. Her lips curved in the first genuine smile he'd seen since Pike's appearance. By afternoon, Silas had gone to the barn. Jane watched from the window as he worked, hammering new boards across the gate, reinforcing the fence along the lower pasture. His strength seemed endless, born of years shaping wilderness into something that resembled safety. When he paused to drink from his canteen, he glanced toward the cabin. She quickly turned away, cheeks warming. Katrina stirred, cooing softly, and Jane lifted her from the cradle. He's a good man, little one, she murmured. Maybe too good for a woman who carries so many lies. The baby smiled, toothless and radiant, as if she knew better. Later, when Silas returned, dusk had begun to creep across the valley. He hung his coat by the door and sniffed the air. Smells mighty fine in here, he said. Jane ladled stew into bowls. Venison, carrots, and beans simmered all afternoon. I can't promise it'll taste fine, she said with a small laugh. It's been a long while since I cooked over a proper fire. He took a seat at the table, bowing his head. Reckon the Lord don't mind how it's cooked long as we give thanks. She folded her hands as he prayed, his voice deep and steady. Heavenly Father, you've seen fit to bring shelter to the lost and strength to the weary. Bless this food to our bodies, and keep your hand upon this house and those within it. Amen. Amen, she echoed softly. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the crackle of the hearth and Katrina's occasional sigh. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, carrying the distant howl of a coyote. Halfway through the meal, Silas said quietly, "You believe what Reverend Powell said this morning, that there ain't a shadow too deep for mercy to reach?" Jane looked down at her bowl. "I want to believe it." "Then believe it," he said simply. "That's all faith is, wanting to believe hard enough to give God the space to do the rest." Her eyes lifted to his. "You make it sound easy." "It ain't," he admitted, leaning back. "When my Mary passed, I near lost the will to pray. I kept working, kept breathing, but I didn't rightly live. Then one night I asked the Lord to send me a reason to start again. Woke up the next day to a snowstorm, and there you were, lying, half dead in it." Jane's breath caught. "You think that was his answer?" Silas nodded. "I don't think it. I know it." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "You shouldn't say such things. You barely know me." "I know enough," he said, voice rough with truth. "I know the Lord don't make mistakes." The firelight flickered across his face, tracing the lines of strength and sorrow there. Jane's heart thudded painfully. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not since the day Elise placed Katrina in her arms and whispered, "You were meant to find her." She rose to clear the dishes, blinking away tears. "I should put Katrina down. It's been a long day." He stood as well, taking the bowls from her hands. "Let me help." Their fingers brushed. Both froze. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single, quiet touch. Warmth against warmth, faith against fear. Then Jane drew back, heart racing. "Thank you, Silas, for everything." He inclined his head. "Ain't done yet." Later that night, when the cabin had gone still, Silas sat on the porch cleaning his rifle. The moon hung pale over the valley, silvering the mist. From inside came the soft hum of Jane's lullaby, low, tender, and full of sorrow. He'd thought his heart long buried with Mary, but now, listening to that sound, something inside him stirred. Not guilt, but grace. He whispered into the cold air, "Lord, if this is your will, give me the strength to protect her, and the wisdom to love her rightly." From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a branch snapped. Silas stiffened, hand moving instinctively to his rifle. He rose, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Another sound, the faint crunch of boots retreating. He waited a long minute, muscles taut. When silence returned, he exhaled slowly. Whoever it was had been watching. He glanced toward the window, where lamplight still glowed softly. Then he turned his gaze back to the trees. "Whoever you are," he murmured, "you best be praying you turn back now, because this house ain't unguarded, by man or by God." Morning broke pale and cold, with frost clinging to the window panes. Silas had dozed little through the night. He'd sat by the hearth cleaning his rifle, his mind turning over the sound he'd heard, the faint snap of a branch, the unmistakable echo of boots retreating into the timber. When he finally stepped outside, the air was sharp enough to bite. The valley lay quiet, dusted with white where dew had frozen overnight. He crouched near the edge of the porch and studied the ground. There, half hidden in the mud, was the print of a boot heel. Not his, and not from town. He followed the faint trail to the stand of pines beyond the corral. Whoever had been there had moved carefully, but not carefully enough. The tracks led toward the ridge, where the forest grew thicker and shadows lingered even under morning sun. Silas's gut told him what his heart already knew. Someone had come looking. He turned back toward the cabin. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and through the window he could see Jane moving about, feeding the fire. The sight of her, the quiet grace in her movements, the baby swaddled against her chest, tightened something deep inside him. He'd promised her safety. That promise had teeth now. When he stepped inside, the warmth hit him like a wave. Jane looked up, her brow creased. "You've been out since dawn. What is it?" Silas brushed frost from his coat. "Tracks near the fence line. Could be a drifter, but I don't believe in coincidences." Jane's face paled. "You think they found me?" I think Pike might have run his mouth to the wrong sort, he said grimly. If there's money in your return, word travels fast in mining country. She swallowed hard. What do we do? We stay calm, Silas replied. I'll set traps along the ridge and ride into town later. Tell Sheriff Lyle to keep an eye open. Jane hesitated, eyes wide with fear. What if they come while you're gone? I won't be long, he assured her. You lock the door, keep the rifle near, and Jane, he paused, meeting her eyes. If you hear anything strange, you take Katrina and go down to the root cellar. Don't open that door for anyone but me. She nodded slowly, voice barely a whisper. All right. Silas pulled on his hat and stepped back outside, but not before glancing once more at the baby in her arms. Katrina's tiny hand waved absently, as if blessing his way. The road to Alder Creek was quiet save for the creak of leather and the distant rush of the river. The town itself seemed unchanged, miners moving between the general store and the saloon, wagons rattling past the blacksmith's forge. But Silas's eyes were sharp, his every sense tuned to threat. He found Sheriff Lyle out behind the jailhouse, chopping wood. The man looked up, wiping his brow. Mornin', Silas, you look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, Silas said, dismounting. Had someone skulking around my place last night, boot tracks by the fence. Lyle frowned. You think it's them claim jumpers again? Silas shook his head. No, this is different. Could be tied to that feller Pike, the one with too much whiskey and not enough conscience. You seen him lately? Left town at sunup, Lyle said. Rode north. Didn't say where. Silas's jaw tightened. Then I'd wager he's not riding alone. Lyle leaned on his axe. You want me to send a couple of men out your way? Not yet, Silas said. Don't want to spook whoever's watching, but if you hear word of strangers asking about a woman or a child, you come find me straight off. The sheriff nodded. I will. You take care up there, Silas. You got more to lose than most. Silas tipped his hat. That I do. Back at the cabin, Jane tried to keep her hands busy, but the stillness pressed heavy. She cleaned, folded laundry, stirred a pot of broth, anything to drown the racing of her heart. Every creak of the walls made her flinch. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps. When she finally settled by the fire to nurse Katrina, her thoughts drifted to Silas. His steady voice, his faith, the way he had prayed for strength the night before. She had never known a man who carried gentleness and strength in equal measure, and yet she feared what her presence might cost him. Your mama's a fool, little one, she whispered to the baby, bringing danger to a man who never asked for it. Katrina gurgled and tugged at her sleeve as if disagreeing. Jane smiled faintly through tears. You're right. Maybe he was meant to find us. By late afternoon, Silas returned. His face was drawn, his coat dusted from the trail. Lyle's keeping an eye out, he said as he stepped through the door. But we'll have to be cautious. I don't want you going into town till I know it's safe. Jane nodded. I understand. He set his rifle by the door and crouched to lay a small iron trap near the threshold, one of several he'd brought from the barn. Don't fret, he said. They won't catch a soul unless they mean trouble. She watched him work, the steady competence of his hands soothing and frightening all at once. Silas, she said softly, you shouldn't have to fight my battles. He paused, glancing up. You think you're the first soul that needed protecting in these hills? That's what a man's called to do, not just dig gold and build fences, but keep what's good in the world from being torn apart. Her throat tightened. You really believe that? I have to, he said simply. Else what's all this for? Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. The horses in the corral stirred nervously. Silas moved to the porch, scanning the tree line again. The feeling of being watched had returned, faint but sure. He turned to Jane. Take the baby and go below, just for now. Silas, please. His voice was gentle but firm. She obeyed, gathering Katrina and moving toward the trapdoor beneath the rug. The root cellar was cool and dim, smelling of earth and apples. She sat on a crate, holding the baby close, listening to the creak of the boards above. Minutes passed like hours. Then, footsteps, slow, careful, a muffled voice. Evening, Jackson. Didn't mean to startle you none. Jane froze. She knew that voice. Pike. Above, Silas answered, his tone edged in steel. You got a talent for showing up where you ain't wanted. Now, don't be like that, Pike drawled. Man sent me from St. Louis. Says he's got claim on a woman and child running under a false name. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Silas's reply came low and dangerous. Can't say I do, and if I did, I surely wouldn't tell you. Pike laughed, a sound without humor. You always did think you could play savior, but there's more than me out here, Jackson. Man like me don't travel alone. Jane's heart pounded. More than him. Outside, the faint snort of horses. More boots. Silas's voice dropped lower, firm and calm. If you or your friends cross that fence, Pike, I'll take it as you mean harm. You got till I count 3 to turn around. Pike sneered. You won't shoot me. 1. The air held its breath. 2. Jane pressed her hand to her mouth, whispering a trembling prayer. Then, silence, followed by the creak of saddles, the shuffle of boots, and finally, the sound of retreating hooves. When the last echo faded, Jane felt her knees give way. She held Katrina tight, tears spilling freely. Above, Silas's footsteps crossed the floor again. Then the trapdoor opened, his face appearing in the dim light. They're gone, he said quietly, for now. Jane's voice broke. You could have been killed. He reached down, helping her up. If the Lord's got work left for me, I won't die easy. As she stepped back into the warm light of the cabin, her heart swelled with both fear and something fiercer. Love born not of safety, but of faith shared in the face of danger. Silas, she whispered, trembling, I don't know how to thank you. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, Don't thank me. Just don't run again. Her eyes glistened. I won't. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and snow, and somewhere beyond the ridge, 3 riders paused in the dark, plotting their return. The storm was not over, but inside that small cabin, faith held fast. Morning broke calm, the valley washed clean by a night of wind. The storm had passed, but the unease in Silas Jackson's chest hadn't. He moved through the barn in quiet focus, tightening saddle straps, checking the rifle he'd oiled by lamplight, and watching the tree line like a man expecting the forest to breathe. A hawk circled overhead. Even the horses were restless, snorting and shifting in their stalls. Silas rubbed a hand over his jaw and whispered a brief prayer. Lord, grant me strength to stand and wisdom to know how. Don't let me fail them. When he stepped out into the yard, Jane was already at the porch, shawl drawn close against the chill. She looked pale but steady. In her arms, Katrina slept, her tiny breaths soft against the fabric of her blanket. You were up before dawn, Jane said. Couldn't sleep, Silas replied. Tracks were gone with the frost, but that don't mean they're far. She glanced toward the woods. You think they'll come back? I know they will, he said simply. Men who ride for money don't quit easy. Her lips pressed together, fear flickering across her face. Then maybe I should leave. I can take the baby and... No. His tone cut through her words, gentle but immovable. You run now, and they'll chase you till you drop. Here, we got walls, a roof, my rifle. She hesitated, eyes glistening. You'd risk your life for us? He stepped closer, his voice quiet but sure. I already have. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither dared to name. Jane lowered her gaze. Silas, I owe you the truth. All of it. He nodded, gesturing toward the bench by the porch. Then let's have it. She sat, the baby cradled in her lap, and took a long breath. When Elise Harlan gave me Katrina, she was dying, but her husband Victor didn't know. He thought the baby stillborn. Elise begged me to flee before he could find out she'd lived. She gave me her wedding cross, said it would protect the child. Jane reached into her shawl and drew out a small golden cross on a thin chain. Silas recognized it immediately for what it was. Expensive, well-crafted, not the kind of trinket a poor woman carried. I thought I could disappear, she continued. I used my maiden name, found work in the foothills, kept moving when strangers asked too many questions. But then a man from St. Louis came looking, said Victor had learned the truth, that he'd put a price on both our heads. Her voice trembled. I've been running ever since. Silas took the cross, turning it over in his rough hands. You risked everything for another woman's child. She's my child now, Jane said fiercely, tears shining. Not by blood, but by the promise I made that night. I'd rather die than see her back in his hands. Silas's throat tightened. That ain't the mark of sin, Jane. That's the measure of love. She looked at him, searching his face. And what if your faith costs you your life, Silas? What if they come with more men next time? He smiled faintly, that slow, steady grin she'd come to trust. Then they'll find me standing between them and you, and the Lord standing between them and me. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She couldn't speak for a long moment. Finally, she whispered, I don't deserve your kindness." He shook his head. "Ain't about deserve, it's about grace. You showed up in the snow, Jane. I could have left you there, but I reckon the Lord would have had a word or two to say about that come judgment." She gave a shaky laugh through her tears. "You always have to bring the Lord into it, don't you?" "Only when I mean it," he said softly. Later that day, Silas worked along the fence line again, driving new posts into the hard ground. Jane helped where she could, hauling buckets, mending feed sacks, keeping Katrina swaddled in a shawl near the porch. The rhythm of their labor was quiet but sure, like the heartbeat of a home refusing to fall to fear. By midday, the sun shone strong enough to melt the frost. Silas paused to wipe his brow, watching Jane as she hummed a lullaby. The baby slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled around her mother's finger. He felt a pull then, not just admiration or duty, but something deeper. It scared him, that tenderness, the way it threatened to unearth the grief he'd buried with Mary. But this was different. This wasn't a second chance to replace what he'd lost. It was a new chance to build something out of pain and hope alike. He whispered a quiet prayer, more to himself than heaven. "Lord, if this love be yours, guide me to it right." Near dusk, Jane came to the barn where Silas was stacking hay. The air smelled of dust and horses, golden light filtering through the cracks in the walls. She lingered in the doorway, her shawl drawn close. "Silas," she said softly, "you've done so much already, but I can't let you fight alone. If they come again, I'll stand beside you." He looked up, surprised but not displeased. "You ever held a rifle before?" "No," she admitted, "but I can learn." He smiled faintly. "You got grit, Jane Arthur, more than some men I've known." She met his gaze, chin high despite the tremor in her voice. "You call it grit. I call it faith." He set aside the hay fork and moved toward her, slow and deliberate. The dying light caught her hair, turning it gold. For a heartbeat, the world went still. "Jane," he murmured, "if anything happens to me—" She cut him off, shaking her head. "Don't. Don't speak like that." But he took her hand anyway, rough fingers closing around hers. "If it does, you take Katrina and go to Reverend Powell. Tell him everything. He'll see you safe." Tears welled in her eyes. "You talk like a man who expects to die." "I talk like a man who's lived long enough to know the cost of keeping promises," he said quietly. Her voice broke. "Then promise me one more thing, Silas, that you'll come back inside tonight, that you'll sit by the fire, not on that porch with your rifle. I can't sleep knowing you're out there alone." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, that's a promise." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you." That night, true to his word, Silas sat by the hearth. Jane had put Katrina to bed, and the cabin was quiet, but for the soft crackle of flames. Jane poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him. Their hands brushed, a small thing, but it sent warmth through both that had nothing to do with the fire. Silas took a sip and said softly, "You know, it's been 3 winters since I've shared a fire with anyone. Feels right." She met his gaze, her heart pounding. "It feels safe." Neither looked away. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the pines like a warning, but inside, a peace settled over them, fragile yet steadfast. Silas set his cup down and leaned back, eyes on the flames. "Whatever comes, Jane, I'm glad you found me." She smiled faintly. "No, Silas, you found me." And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that something holy had taken root between them, something that would not be shaken by fear or storm or men with guns. It was love, quiet, hard-earned, and blessed by the same grace that had brought them together in the snow. The next morning broke with a quiet that set Silas's teeth on edge. The world felt too still. No wind through the pines, no distant hammer of mining tools from the valley below, no cry of hawk overhead. Even the horses were uneasy, stamping their hooves and blowing through their nostrils as if they could smell the change in the air. Silas came out of the barn with his rifle slung low across his arm. His eyes swept the horizon, the pale line of the ridge where the snow met the sky, the faint thread of the wagon trail that wound down into the goldfields. He didn't see movement, but his gut told him trouble was coming. He walked back to the cabin, where Jane was standing on the porch, Katrina in her arms. Her shawl flapped in the breeze, and she looked at him with that steady, searching gaze that had begun to undo him. "You feel it too," she said quietly. He nodded. "Wind's changed. Air smells like iron." Jane shifted the baby closer. "You think it's them?" "I'd bet what little gold I got," he answered. She didn't argue. Her fingers brushed the cross at her throat, the one she'd told him belonged to Elise Harlan, and whispered, "Lord, keep us." Silas climbed the steps, standing beside her. "We'll be ready. I ain't about to let harm come to either of you." Jane looked up at him, fear warring with trust. "I know you won't, Silas, but I don't want you to lose your soul defending mine." He almost smiled, a sad, fond curve of his mouth. "Don't you worry, Jane. I've wrestled with God before. I reckon he knows where I stand." By mid-morning, the first echo of hooves came rolling through the valley. Faint at first, then clearer, then unmistakable. Jane froze, heart pounding. Silas moved with the calm precision of a man who'd faced danger too many times to flinch now. He checked the rifle, loaded fresh rounds, and nodded toward the back door. "Take the baby to the root cellar. Stay low. Don't make a sound unless you hear me call." Jane wanted to protest, but one look at his eyes silenced her. They were steady, sure. The eyes of a man who'd already made peace with whatever might come. "I'll be right here," she whispered. "I know." He brushed his fingers against her arm. A fleeting touch, but one that held more comfort than words could. Then she disappeared inside, closing the trapdoor behind her. Silas stepped onto the porch and waited. They came in a small cloud of dust, 4 riders, dark coats and hard faces, their horses lathered from the climb. The man in front was lean, sharp-featured, and wore his hat low over cold eyes. Silas recognized the type. Guns for hire. Mean by choice. The leader reined up in front of the porch. "You Silas Jackson?" "Depends who's asking," Silas replied evenly. "Name's Burke. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Victor Harlan. He's looking for something that belongs to him." Silas kept his rifle balanced casually against his arm. "Don't reckon I got anything of his." Burke's lip curled. "You got a woman here, Jane Arthur. Used to be Harlan's housemaid. Ran off with something she shouldn't have." Silas's jaw tightened. "You mean her life?" Burke laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That woman's a liar and a thief. She took what wasn't hers. A child." Silas's finger brushed the rifle's trigger guard. "Funny thing about thieves. Sometimes the man calling them that's the real one." Burke's eyes narrowed. "You best think real careful, friend. We ain't lawmen, but we got Mr. Harlan's money and his orders. You hand her over and we'll ride off quiet. Otherwise," he glanced toward the cabin, eyes hard as nails, "otherwise, we burn this place to the ground." Silas didn't move. His voice came low, steady as stone. "You take one more step toward this cabin, Burke, and you'll find out what kind of man you're dealing with." The air went taut as a drawn wire. Burke studied him for a moment, then smiled slow. "You got grit. I'll give you that. Shame it won't save you." He nodded to his men. "Circle the house." Silas's rifle barked once, the shot echoing across the valley. One of the men yelped and went down, clutching his shoulder before he hit the snow. The others scattered, diving for cover. Bullets whined past the porch, splintering wood. Silas ducked behind a post, reloaded, and fired again. Deliberate, controlled. The firefight lasted minutes that felt like hours. Smoke and gunpowder filled the air. The horses screamed, panicked. Then silence. When the smoke cleared, Burke's men were retreating, dragging the wounded man onto a horse. Burke himself was the last to turn, hatred carved into every line of his face. "This ain't over, Jackson," he shouted. "You'll regret crossing Victor Harlan." Then he wheeled his horse and galloped after them, disappearing into the trees. Silas waited until the last echo of hooves faded before lowering his rifle. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sick, hollow rush that always followed violence. He turned and went inside, pulling up the cellar hatch. Jane was crouched there, the baby clutched to her chest, eyes wide and tearful. When she saw him, she scrambled out, nearly dropping to her knees beside him. "You're alive!" she cried. He gave a tired smile. "Still here." She pressed a trembling hand to his chest. "I heard the shots," I thought. He caught her hand in his, rough and warm. "Don't. It's over for now." Jane broke down then, sobbing into his shoulder. He held her, one arm around her back, the other cupping the back of her head. When her sobs quieted, she whispered, "They won't stop, will they?" Silas's jaw tightened. "No. Men like that don't stop till someone makes them." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Then what do we do?" He glanced toward the window, where the smoke from gunfire still hung in the air. "We pray," he said softly. "Then we make ready." That night, after Jane and Katrina had fallen asleep, Silas sat by the fire, his Bible open on his knee. The flickering light cast deep shadows across the room, and the air smelled faintly of powder and pine smoke. He read quietly, "The Lord is my rock, and my fortress, and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust." He closed the book and bowed his head. "If it's your will, Lord, see us through this. Give me the courage to do right and not just what's easy." Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow, soft, endless. And somewhere beyond the ridge, Burke and his men were already planning their return. But for tonight, the cabin held peace, fragile, fleeting, but real. And in Silas's heart, something had shifted. Protecting Jane and Katrina no longer felt like duty, it felt like destiny. The snow fell harder through the night and into morning, blanketing the valley in silence. It made the world look pure again, clean, almost peaceful, though Silas Jackson knew that peace was a thin layer over trouble waiting to surface. When dawn came, he stood outside the cabin, watching his breath curl in the cold air. His rifle leaned against the porch rail, and his thoughts churned as steady as the creek below the ridge. He heard the door open behind him. Jane stepped out, wrapped in her worn wool shawl, her hair pinned but coming loose in curls. In her arms, Katrina slept against her shoulder. "You didn't sleep again," she said softly. Silas didn't look at her. Couldn't. Kept thinking on what Burke said. If he's riding for Victor Harlan, he ain't done yet. He'll come back meaner, maybe with lawmen in his pocket. Jane moved closer. "Then what will you do?" "Do what I should have done from the start. Go to town. Talk to Reverend Powell. Talk to folks who still know right from wrong." Her brow creased. "You think they'll help?" Silas finally looked at her, eyes tired but sure. "In this valley, we help our own, and right now, that includes you." Jane's eyes filled, though she tried to hide it with a smile. "Then I'll pray you're right." He tipped his hat. "Pray hard, Jane." The ride to town was long and cold. The snow had turned the trail into a ribbon of white that wound through pine and frozen creek beds. Silas rode slow, eyes sharp, rifle across his saddle. He'd lived too many winters alone not to know how the world could turn on a man in a blink. By the time he reached Alder Creek, the mining town was stirring to life. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer rang through the crisp air. Men stomped snow from their boots outside the saloon, and a few women swept the steps in front of the mercantile. He dismounted in front of the small clapboard church that stood at the town's edge, whitewashed, simple, with a bell that looked like it had seen more prayers than polish. Inside, the air was cool and still. Reverend Powell stood by the altar, lighting a lamp. His hair had gone silver, but his eyes were steady, the kind that looked straight through a man's excuses and into his soul. "Silas Jackson," he said, turning with a smile. "Got something I need to speak to you about. Trouble's found me." Powell's smile faded. "What kind of trouble?" Silas told him everything. About finding Jane in the snow, about the baby, about Victor Harlan's men and the gunfire at his cabin. When he finished, Powell let out a long breath and set his lamp aside. "You sure you want to stand between that woman and her past?" the Reverend asked. "I already am," Silas said simply. "Ain't about what I want now. It's about what's right." Powell studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you're not standing alone." He motioned for Silas to follow him outside. Across the road, a few miners were gathered near the blacksmith's forge. Powell raised his hand and called out, "Boys, come here a moment." Within minutes, half a dozen men stood before them, rough from work, faces windburned, but eyes clear and loyal. "This man's got trouble coming," Powell said. "Men from St. Louis aiming to take what isn't theirs. He's asking for help, not for vengeance, but for justice." The miners glanced at one another, then back at Silas. One man, broad-shouldered with a beard full of frost, stepped forward. "You're talking about those riders passed through 2 days ago, ain't you? They were asking questions about a woman and a baby. Didn't like the way they looked." "Same ones," Silas said. The miner spat in the snow. "Well, they didn't look like men with much respect for women or babies. Count me in." Another spoke up. "Me too. I owe you one, Silas. You pulled me out of the mine shaft that winter I near froze." Powell clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Looks like the Lord still works through willing hands." Silas gave a small, grateful nod. "Appreciate it. Don't want to fight, but if it comes, I'll take help from good men." "You've got it," the Reverend said firmly. "You're not facing this alone." Back at the cabin, Jane spent the day trying not to let fear steal her peace. She moved through her chores, mending a blanket, stirring a pot of stew, humming softly to Katrina, but her mind was far away, caught between prayer and worry. When she went out to fetch water, she paused at the edge of the yard and looked toward the road that wound down into the valley. Snow fell gently, and the world looked deceptively calm. She whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. Lord, bring him back safe. You've already taken too much from both of us. Don't take him too. Katrina gurgled in her sling as if agreeing. Jane smiled faintly and kissed her daughter's head. It was late afternoon when she heard the crunch of hooves. Jane's heart leapt, then steadied when she saw Silas riding up through the snow, flanked by 3 other men and a wagon behind them carrying supplies. She ran out to meet him, relief flooding her face. You're back! Silas dismounted and gave her a tired smile. He nodded toward the men, who tipped their hats politely. Reverend Powell and some of the miners aimed to stay a while, help watch the place. Jane's eyes filled with tears. You didn't have to. Yeah, I did, Silas said. You and Katrina are my responsibility now. Theirs too, far as I'm concerned. Reverend Powell dismounted, his expression kind. Mrs. Arthur, the Lord sometimes sends angels in the shape of tired men with rifles. I reckon you'll forgive us for the intrusion. Jane laughed through her tears. Gladly, Reverend. You're most welcome. That evening, the cabin was filled with quiet strength. The men shared coffee and cornbread by the fire, speaking in low tones about watch shifts and plans if Burke returned. Jane sat nearby with Katrina, rocking gently. For the first time since she'd fled St. Louis, she felt something close to safety. Not because danger had passed, but because she wasn't facing it alone. When the talk quieted, Reverend Powell opened his Bible. Psalm 46, he said softly. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Silas bowed his head. Jane followed, her hand resting over Katrina's heart. The fire crackled, the wind sighed against the windows, and for a little while, the fear that had followed them both since that night in the snow eased its grip. After the men turned in, Jane lingered by the hearth, watching the flames dance. Silas came to stand beside her, his voice low. You did good today, he said. She looked up at him, surprised. I didn't do anything. You stayed. You prayed. That's more'n most do when trouble comes, she smiled faintly. And you, Silas Jackson, went and brought half a town to our doorstep. He chuckled softly. Maybe the Lord figured we'd need the company. She studied his face, the rough lines, the tired eyes, the quiet strength. You believe all this is part of his plan? He nodded. Every bit of it, even the hard parts. Her gaze softened. Then I'll keep believing too. Silas looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, Jane, if anything happens, you and Katrina are family now. Don't ever forget that. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. And you, Silas, are ours. Outside, the snow fell heavy again, muffling the world in white. Inside, 2 hearts, once strangers bound by circumstance, found a peace that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with faith. The valley had taken sides, and heaven itself seemed to lean toward their cabin. The first warning came with the wind. Just after midnight, Silas woke to a faint creak, not of the cabin settling, but of hooves on frozen ground. He held still, every sense sharpening. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Beside him, the faint sound of Jane's breathing and the softer sigh of Katrina's dreams. He eased from his bed and reached for the rifle. Reverend Powell, asleep by the hearth, stirred when Silas touched his shoulder. The old preacher opened his eyes without a sound. The kind of man who didn't startle when danger whispered. Silas put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the window. Powell nodded once and reached for the lantern, turning the wick down to a glow. Outside, the wind carried the muffled snort of horses and the low murmur of men. Burke, Silas muttered under his breath. Powell's voice was a whisper. How many? Can't tell. More than before. Powell's face tightened. Then we wake the others. Within moments, the cabin came alive with quiet movement. 2 of the miners crept to the windows with rifles, another to the door. Jane gathered Katrina into her arms, heart pounding but hands steady. Basement, Silas told her softly. Like before. No, Jane whispered back. I'll not hide while you fight. I can help. He stopped her with a look. This ain't stubborn pride, Jane. It's me asking you to keep her safe. Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. Then promise me you'll come back to us. I'll do my best, he said simply. She caught his sleeve as he turned. Silas? He looked back. Jane's lips trembled, but her voice didn't break. The Lord brought you to me. I don't believe he means to take you away. Silas touched her cheek gently. Then I'll hold him to that. He bent, kissed Katrina's head, and disappeared out into the dark. The night outside was sharp and cruel. Snow fell in fine flakes, glinting against the faint light of the moon. Silas crouched behind the woodpile near the porch, the rifle balanced on his knee. Reverend Powell took the opposite corner. The miners spread in a semicircle around the cabin. From the woods, movement, a shadow, then another. Burke's voice carried through the trees, low and mocking. You can't keep her forever, Jackson. Harlan's gold says that woman and her brat come back with me. Dead or alive, don't make no difference. Silas's voice rang out clear and strong. You can tell Victor Harlan he's got no claim here. Not on her, not on the child, not on this land. You ride away now, Burke, and maybe the Lord'll forgive the fool you've become. Burke laughed. Cold, mean, like the sound of iron grinding stone. The Lord don't ride these parts tonight. Then came the sound of a match striking. A moment later, fire flared, a torch arcing through the air, landing on the haystack near the barn. Flames leapt, crackling and spitting, the heat blooming in the snow-heavy air. Silas cursed under his breath and fired. The shot hit the torchbearer squarely in the leg, sending him sprawling. Gunfire erupted in answer. The night filled with thunder. The miners held their line, returning fire in sharp bursts. Bullets shattered bark and splintered wood. Smoke mingled with falling snow, turning the world into a haze of flame and fury. Silas saw Burke moving through the trees, a dark shape among shadows. He tracked him with the rifle, but before he could fire, a bullet whined past his ear. He ducked, rolled behind the trough, and whispered, "Lord, guide my hand." Then he stood, aimed, and fired once more. The shot found its mark. Burke's hat flew from his head, the man staggering before disappearing into the brush. Inside the cabin, Jane huddled in the corner near the cellar door, Katrina clutched tight. The baby whimpered, frightened by the noise, and Jane whispered prayers between trembling lips. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she murmured, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Smoke drifted in through a crack in the door, but the fire outside hadn't reached the cabin yet. Jane laid the baby down in her basket, then grabbed a pail of water from near the hearth. If the fire spread, she'd be ready. The sound of gunfire drew closer. A window shattered. Jane ducked, heart hammering. Then, another sound. Footsteps on the porch. "Silas?" she whispered. No answer. She reached for the small pistol Silas had left on the mantel, his backup weapon, and gripped it with both hands. The doorknob turned once. Then again, harder. Jane raised the pistol. The door burst open, and Reverend Powell stumbled inside, coughing from smoke. "The barn's going," he shouted. "We gotta douse it before the whole place catches." Jane ran to the door, saw the fire licking up the barn wall, and without hesitation grabbed another bucket. She plunged it into the trough and threw the water again and again until the flames hissed and guttered out. Powell stared at her, panting. "You're not the timid woman I met last week." Jane smiled faintly through soot and tears. "Fear's a poor excuse to stop doing what's right." The gunfire waned, replaced by groans and the sound of men retreating. The miners shouted after them, their voices ragged with victory. Silas stood in the yard, smoke rising around him, rifle still in hand. Burke's men were scattering, dragging the wounded and leaving behind their pride. Burke himself staggered from behind a tree, clutching his side. His hat was gone, his face pale with fury. "You don't know who you're crossing," he rasped. Silas lowered the rifle. "I know exactly who I'm standing for." Burke raised his revolver, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from the cabin doorway. Burke froze. A dark stain spread across his coat. Jane stood there, pistol trembling in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Burke looked at her, disbelief twisting his features. "You." Then he fell, face first, into the snow. Silas turned toward her slowly, chest heaving. "Jane." She was shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He was going to shoot you." He crossed the yard in 2 strides, took the pistol from her hand, and pulled her into his arms. "I know," he whispered against her hair. "You did what you had to." Reverend Powell stepped forward, eyes solemn. The Lord saw what happened here tonight. No sin in defending the innocent. Jane pressed her face against Silas's chest, sobbing. It's over? Silas looked toward the ridge, where the last of the riders vanished into the trees. For now, he said softly. But the world don't end in gunfire, Jane. It ends and begins again in forgiveness. By dawn, the fire was out. The barn stood scorched but standing. The snow was red in places, but the sun rose over it just the same, painting the valley gold. Silas stood beside Jane and Reverend Powell as they buried Burke in a shallow grave near the tree line. There were no words of malice, only the Reverend's soft prayer. Lord, judge him with mercy. He was a man lost to greed, but still one of your own. Jane closed her eyes and held Katrina tight. When it was done, Silas took her hand. You all right? She looked up at him, eyes tired but calm. I will be, so long as you're here, he smiled faintly. Then I reckon we'll both be just fine. That night, as the valley rested in peace hard-earned, Silas sat by the fire, watching Jane hum to Katrina. The baby's small fingers curled around her mother's cross. Silas whispered a prayer into the quiet. Thank you, Lord, for bringing light out of the snow and love out of sorrow. And somewhere deep in his chest, a voice, soft but sure, answered back, You were never alone. The morning after the gunfire, the world felt hollow and still, the kind of silence that comes only after something has been broken and remade. Smoke drifted over the valley like a ghost, the air sharp with ash and the faint sweetness of burned hay. Snow melted in dark patches around the barn, the ground churned from boots and blood. Silas stood alone in the yard, hat in hand, looking at what was left. He'd spent most of the night repairing the barn roof and hauling water until his shoulders screamed. Now the adrenaline had faded, leaving a dull ache in its place, both in body and soul. Reverend Powell had left early that morning to fetch the sheriff from Miller's Pass, insisting it was better to tell the truth than let rumors take root. Jane watched from the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Katrina slept in her arms, oblivious to the wreckage around her. When Silas finally turned to face her, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but beneath it, something steadier. You should rest, she said softly. Can't, he replied. Still a few things need seeing to before the law gets here. Will they arrest us? She asked quietly. He shook his head. No cause for that. Burke came here with murder in mind. We stood our ground, but the law still has to look, same as the Lord does. Jane nodded slowly. I'm not afraid of the truth. I only fear what they might think of me. Silas's voice softened. You saved my life last night. Any man who can't see that for what it is ain't worth answering to. She smiled faintly, then looked toward the barn. I never fired a gun before. I didn't think I could. He glanced at her, admiration in his gaze. You ain't the same woman I found in the snow, Jane Arthur. Her eyes met his. No, she said. I don't suppose I am. That woman was dying. Silas's jaw worked, as though there was more he wanted to say, but before he could, the distant sound of hooves broke the quiet. They both turned. A small group of riders approached along the trail, the sheriff, Reverend Powell, and 2 deputies. Jane's hand tightened around the shawl. Silas exhaled slowly. It's all right. Let's face it together. Sheriff Dunn was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and sharp eyes that missed little. He dismounted and looked over the property, boots crunching in the snow. Reverend here says you had trouble last night, he said, his voice even but edged with curiosity. Silas nodded. Burke and 5 men, they came to take a woman that didn't belong to 'em. Set the barn on fire. I reckon you can see what came of it. Dunn's eyes flicked to the burned haystack, then to the shallow grave near the tree line. That Burke in the ground? Yes, sir. The sheriff gave a long, slow sigh. Well, that might save me some trouble. Been after that fool 3 counties over for robbery and assault. Reverend Powell cleared his throat. He would have killed them both, Sheriff. The woman acted only to save Mr. Jackson's life. Dunn nodded thoughtfully. That right? Jane stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. It is, Sheriff. He was going to shoot Silas. I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted it to stop. The sheriff studied her for a long moment, not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who'd seen too much of what desperation could do. Mrs. Arthur, he said at last, I've seen plenty of men die with less reason than that. You did right. Jane let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Silas's shoulders relaxed slightly. So that's the end of it then? The sheriff looked out over the valley. Far as the law's concerned, yes. But word'll spread, Jackson. Harlan won't like losing his man. You'd best be ready if he comes looking for retribution. I'll be ready, Silas said simply. Dunn nodded once, then tipped his hat to Jane. You've got yourself a good man here, ma'am. Don't let him fool you with that quiet. When they rode off, the silence that followed felt lighter than before, the kind that comes after mercy. Later that afternoon, Silas and Reverend Powell mended what they could of the barn, while Jane prepared stew over the fire. The baby gurgled in her cradle, bright-eyed and healthy, and for the first time since that blizzard night, laughter found its way back into the cabin. Reverend Powell paused his hammering and smiled. I'll say this much, the Lord surely meant for your paths to cross. No man wanders into a storm for nothing. Silas chuckled under his breath. Didn't feel like Providence at the time. Most miracles don't, Powell replied, grinning. Jane looked up from her cooking. You think the Lord still writes stories like this, Reverend? He leaned against the fence post, eyes twinkling. Every sunrise is another chapter, Mrs. Arthur. Just depends if we've got the courage to read it. That night, after the Reverend had gone and the baby was asleep, Jane stood by the window watching snow drift across the valley. The stars burned clear and close, as if heaven itself leaned down to listen. Silas came to stand beside her, the lamplight soft against his face. She's growing strong, he said, nodding toward the cradle. Jane smiled. She's got your stubbornness. He laughed quietly. Didn't know it was contagious. A long silence followed, the kind filled with unspoken words. Jane, he said at last, there's something I've been meaning to ask. She turned toward him, heart thudding. What is it? He hesitated. When the snow clears and spring comes, you could stay here if you'd want it. Not out of charity or duty, but because this feels like home. To me, anyway. Jane's eyes filled, but her voice was steady. I don't know where else I'd belong, Silas. Not after what we've been through. He nodded slowly, as though afraid to hope. Then we'll make it ours, one sunrise at a time. Outside, a wolf howled far off in the hills, the sound lonely but not sorrowful, a wild hymn to the night. Jane leaned against him, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. You said once that grief don't fade easy, she whispered. He nodded. It don't, but it can make room for something new. She looked up at him, eyes shimmering in the firelight. Like love? He smiled faintly. Yeah, like love. That night, as snow whispered against the roof and the baby dreamed by the fire, Silas Jackson closed his eyes and felt for the first time in years the peace of a man who had found what he didn't know he was missing. A home, a family, and a woman who had turned a frozen night into a lifetime's warmth. The first true day of spring came almost unnoticed. It was Reverend Powell who saw it first. A trickle of water running down the slope beside the church, glinting under the weak sunlight. The Lord's thawing his canvas, he'd said with a grin, and sure enough, by mid-morning the valley shimmered with meltwater. Snow slipped from the roofs in heavy sheets, leaving behind mud, grass, and the scent of pine rising warm for the first time in months. At the Jackson Ranch, the world felt reborn. Jane stood on the porch, the shawl draped loosely around her shoulders, and breathed deep the clean air. Inside, Katrina cooed from her cradle while Silas split wood by the barn. The steady rhythm of the axe, the song of the creek, the faint laughter of distant miners, it all wove together into a sound she hadn't heard in years. Peace. She turned as Silas approached, wiping sweat from his brow. Hard to believe it's the same place, he said, looking out across the field where the snow had melted into rows of damp soil. Couple months back, we near froze to death. Now look at it. Jane smiled. God has a way of surprising us. He leaned the axe against the porch rail and took her hand gently. You've been doing that too, you know? Her brow furrowed slightly. Surprising you? He nodded, his eyes warm. When I found you in that snow, I figured maybe the Lord sent me to save a soul. Never thought he might be saving fright. Mine too. Jane's lips trembled, but she smiled. We saved each other, Silas. That's what love does. Before he could reply, Katrina's small cry rose from inside. Jane laughed softly. There's our little hymn, right on time. She disappeared into the cabin, and Silas stood a while longer, listening to the creek and the sound of life returning to his land. Later that afternoon, Silas rode into town for supplies. Reverend Powell's horse trotted beside his, the old preacher humming under his breath. Word is, Powell said, The mail wagon's bringing a circuit judge this way next week. Folks are hoping he'll settle a few land disputes and maybe clean up what's left of Harlan's hold on the mines. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. Harlan's still breathing then? Oh, he's breathing, Powell said grimly. But he ain't happy. Lost his best enforcer and his contracts with the Denver company both. Some men don't take kindly to losing what they think they own. Silas's gaze drifted toward the horizon. You think he'll come this far? Hard to say. But men like that don't forgive or forget. They reached Miller's Pass just as the sun dropped low, painting the buildings gold and pink. The town had changed since winter. The streets busier, wagons creaking with trade, women sweeping porches clear of the last of the snow. At the general store, Miss Clara waved from behind the counter. You give Jane my regards. I will, Silas promised, gathering his supplies, flour, lamp oil, a few nails, and a small bag of sugar. He hesitated at the last shelf and added something else, a bolt of blue calico. Powell raised an eyebrow. For the lady? Silas shrugged, trying not to smile. Figure she's earned a dress that ain't patched through twice. The Reverend laughed. That's the first sign of courtin', if I ever saw one. Silas only shook his head, though a warmth crept into his chest. Back home, the scent of stew greeted him before he'd even dismounted. Jane met him at the door, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair loose from its braid. You were gone long, she said, though her tone was more relief than reproach. Town was busy, he said. Brought a few things back. He handed her the sugar first, then the calico. Jane froze, fingers brushing over the fabric. Oh, Silas. It ain't much, he said awkwardly, but I figured spring calls for something, prettier than wool and mending thread. Her eyes shimmered. No one's ever given me anything like this. He cleared his throat. Guess there's a first for everything. She smiled, that quiet, luminous kind of smile that reached her eyes, and for a long moment, the air between them held something unspoken but undeniable. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, Jane set the table while Silas fed the fire. Katrina slept soundly in her cradle, her tiny breath steady. Reverend Powell said the circuit judge is comin', Silas said between spoonfuls of stew. Means I can finally file for that land claim proper. Jane looked up. You never did that before? Didn't have reason to, he said. Wasn't planning on staying forever. Just me and the mine. But things change. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. And what would make you stay now? He met her gaze. You already know. The words hung in the air, simple and raw. Jane felt her heart stutter, a warmth spreading through her chest. She set down her spoon, suddenly shy. Silas, you've been more to me than I could ever deserve. But, he reached across the table, his calloused fingers brushing hers. No but, Jane. I ain't asking for anything yet, just saying I ain't going anywhere. She smiled softly. Then neither am I. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Silas was outside repairing the fence when he noticed movement along the ridge. A lone rider in a dark coat, pausing to look down at the cabin. He narrowed his eyes, hand resting on the rifle slung across the post. The rider lingered only a moment before turning and disappearing into the pines. Silas watched until the last trace was gone, a familiar unease coiling in his gut. Who was it? Jane asked from the porch. She'd seen his stillness and come to stand beside him, shawl wrapped tight. Don't know, he said slowly. But I don't like that he didn't wave. Jane looked up at him, fear flickering behind her calm. You think it's Harlan's men? He forced a small smile. Could be a hunter, could be nothing, but I'll keep watch all the same. She nodded, trusting him as she always did. But that night, as she knelt beside the bed to pray, her words trembled. Lord, she whispered, you gave us this peace. Don't let it be taken so soon. Watch over him, over us, and let your will be done. Outside, the wind sighed through the melting trees. Not cruelly, but as if reminding the valley that even spring carried shadows. And somewhere, far off in the timber, a rider watched the smoke rising from the Jackson cabin and turned his horse toward the east, toward Victor Harlan's camp. The thaw came quicker than anyone expected. By mid-March, the valley floor was a quilt of green and gold, wildflowers pushing up through the damp earth. The river, swollen with meltwater, roared through the canyon, a sound both beautiful and foreboding. Silas stood at the fence line one morning, his hat low against the wind, scanning the ridge beyond the timber. He'd been doing that most mornings since the lone rider appeared. Not out of fear, but vigilance. The kind of watch a man keeps when he's learned how fast peace can vanish. Jane joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You're still looking for him," she said softly. He nodded. "Saw horse tracks 2 days ago near the North Trail. Not sure if it's the same man, but I don't like that they're fresh." Jane frowned. "You think they'll come back?" He hesitated before answering. "Harlan's too proud to let go of a grudge, but the Lord's seen us through worse." She smiled faintly. "Then we'll keep our faith and do what we can." He turned toward her, a small smile breaking through his worry. "You sound more like Powell every day." "Maybe I've been listening," she said. Katrina's cry from the porch drew their attention. Jane laughed softly and turned to go, but Silas caught her hand for just a moment longer. "If I ain't back by sundown, don't wait. Lock the door and keep the pistol close." Jane froze. "Where are you going?" "Up the ridge," he said quietly. "I need to see what's out there." She looked into his eyes, fear flickering there. "Be careful." "I always am." The climb was steep, the trail still slick with patches of snow. Silas moved slow and silent, rifle in hand, boots sinking into soft earth. The sun climbed high above the pines, but the shadows underneath stayed cold. He followed the trail north until he found what he'd feared. Hoofprints. Not one set, but several. He crouched low, brushing the edge of one track. Deep impressions, narrow-hoofed, cavalry style. Whoever rode through had been trained, not just drifters or hunters. Then he found something else, a cigarette butt still warm, its ember faintly glowing. Someone was near. Silas froze, listening. The woods were quiet except for the wind and a distant hawk. But his instincts, honed from years of prospecting and surviving out here, told him he wasn't alone. He slipped behind a pine trunk, scanning the slope. A twig snapped. Silas turned just as a figure stepped from behind a boulder. A young man, maybe 20, dressed in a worn gray coat. He wasn't aiming his rifle yet, but his eyes held that same hard edge Silas had seen in Burke's. "Don't reach," the young man said. "Mr. Harlan sent me to find you." Silas's voice stayed even. "Then you found me." The man's jaw tightened. "He says you've got something that belongs to him." The man nodded toward the valley below. "The woman and the child. He says they're his concern." Silas's eyes narrowed. "You ride back and tell Harlan this. The Lord don't grant men ownership over souls, no matter how much gold they think they own." The young man hesitated. "He said you'd talk like that." "Then he knows me better than I figured," Silas replied, lowering his rifle slowly, not in surrender, but as a calculated act of calm. "You don't look the kind that enjoys killin'. Don't start today." The boy's hand trembled slightly on the rifle. His lips parted, as if to speak, and then a branch cracked behind them. Both turned. Another rider emerged, older, meaner, his revolver already drawn. "Enough talk, Will. You had your chance." The boy flinched. "Mr. Dagg." But Dagg didn't wait. He fired. The shot grazed Silas's shoulder, spinning him backward. He dropped to one knee, blood hot under his coat, and returned fire instinctively. The bullet struck Dagg square in the chest, sending him crashing into the snow. The echo rolled through the hills, sharp, final, and followed by silence. The young man, Will, stood frozen, staring between the two of them. "Go," Silas said through gritted teeth. "You tell Harlan what happened here, and you tell him not to send another soul. Next time, I won't aim to wound." Will hesitated, then turned and ran, disappearing down the ridge. Silas pressed a hand to his shoulder, grimacing. The wound wasn't deep, but it burned fierce. He leaned against a tree, breathing hard, before making his slow descent back to the valley. Back at the cabin, Jane had spent the day cleaning, baking, and trying not to stare at the clock. The hours stretched long. When the sun began to dip, she went out to the porch and scanned the ridgeline, heart heavy with unease. Katrina slept soundly, but Jane's prayers grew restless. "Lord, please bring him home safe," she whispered, her hands clasped tight. "Don't let him walk the shadowed valley alone." When she finally saw him, a dark figure limping down the trail, her knees nearly gave out. She ran to meet him halfway, skirts gathering mud. "Silas?" He smiled faintly through the pain. "I told you not to wait. You think I'd just sit and sew while you bled in the woods?" She said, half angry, half crying. He chuckled weakly. "Fair point." She slipped an arm around his waist and helped him to the porch. Inside, she cleaned the wound with trembling hands, tears spilling freely as she worked. "It's just a graze," he murmured. "Had worse from a fall in the mine." "You're bleeding," she whispered. "And you make jokes." He smiled faintly. That's how a man keeps the Lord from getting tired of listening to his groaning. She laughed softly, despite herself, and pressed a clean bandage to the wound. What happened? Harlan sent 2 men. One's still breathing, for now. Leo, I told him to tell his master to stay off this land. Jane's face went pale. He won't stop, will he? Silas met her eyes. No, but neither will I. That night, as Silas dozed fitfully by the fire, Jane sat beside him, the Bible open in her lap. She read quietly, the verses steadying her trembling hands. Fear not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Her voice broke, but she kept reading, the words rising like a shield around them. When she looked up, she found Silas awake, watching her through the soft flicker of firelight. Keep reading, he murmured. Ain't no medicine like that. Jane smiled through tears. You should rest. He nodded slowly. I will, long as you stay right there. I'm not going anywhere, she said, and as the wind moved through the thawing hills, carrying the faint echoes of their trials and their prayers, like Silas Jackson closed his eyes, not in fear, but in faith. For the first time since winter, he dreamed not of the past, but of tomorrow. The morning dawned bright and raw, the scent of pine heavy in the air. Jane woke to the sound of Katrina's laughter, small, sweet sounds that turned even the hardest mornings into blessings. Silas was already outside, working with his left arm bound in a sling. The wound from Dag's bullet still burned, but he wouldn't admit it. A man who'd spent half his life breaking rock in the goldfields didn't know how to sit idle. Jane leaned in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders. You should rest that arm. He looked up, smiling beneath his hat brim. I rest every time you scold me, so I reckon I'm halfway healed by now. She shook her head, amused. Stubborn as a mule. Only when it comes to living, he said, tipping his hat before turning back to the fence rail he was mending. She watched him for a long moment, the way the morning light caught the gold in his hair, the quiet steadiness in him. There had been days, not long ago, when she hadn't believed a man like Silas Jackson could still exist, gentle in strength, humble in faith, steady when storms came. Later that morning, old Henry Powell arrived, his horse lathered and his cheeks flushed with excitement. Jackson, he called as he rode up. You'll want to hear this. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. What's the fuss, Henry? Powell dismounted, pulling off his hat. Judge Harmon's due in Alder Creek by week's end. Circuits from Fort Mill settle in disputes, blessin' marriages, hear in petitions. Man's been on the trail for months, they say, reliable as they come. Jane, who'd come outside carrying Katrina, paused at the word marriages. Powell grinned when he saw her expression. That's right, ma'am. If you two want things proper before the Lord and law, now's your chance. Don't get many like Harmon up here. Silas's eyes softened as he looked at Jane. We'd best ride in then. Her lips parted, her cheeks coloring faintly. Do you mean, truly? He stepped close, his voice low. Jane, I made a promise when I pulled you from that snow that I'd see you safe, see this little one grow. I didn't expect the Lord would give me more than that. He paused, his thumb brushing her sleeve. But he did, and I'd like to stand before him and before everyone else and call you my wife. Tears sprang to her eyes. Silas? Katrina reached for his beard then, babbling, and Silas laughed softly. Seems the little one approves. Jane pressed her forehead to his shoulder, whispering through happy tears, Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Powell grinned broadly. Well, I'll be. You two have been a sermon in boots since winter. I'll fetch the Reverend and make sure Harmon stays in town long enough for you. Silas clasped his old friend's hand. Much obliged, Henry. Alder Creek was alive when they arrived 2 days later. Wagons lined the street, while horses tied outside the saloon and general store. The air buzzed with conversation. Farmers bringing disputes, widows bringing petitions, young couples waiting to have their unions sanctified by Judge Harmon himself. Silas and Jane drew attention the moment they entered the town square. Folks remembered the miner who'd left town after losing his wife, and they saw now a man reborn, standing tall beside a woman with grace written in every motion, holding a baby with curls like spun gold. They were greeted with smiles, nods, and curious whispers, but not the kind born of malice. This was frontier gossip softened by hope. Judge Harmon was a stout man with keen gray eyes and a kind mouth. His coat was dusted from the trail, and a worn Bible rested in his hand as if it had grown there. Silas introduced himself, then Jane. Harmon listened quietly, nodding as they told their story. What they could tell anyway. Jane spoke little, but when she did, her voice was steady and full of grace. "I owe my life to this man," she said, "and my daughters too." Harmon smiled gently. "Then it's a good day for the both of you. We'll see it made right before God and the law tomorrow afternoon. I'll file it proper when I ride east." Silas thanked him, relief visible in his posture. But as they turned to leave, Harmon added softly, "Mr. Jackson, a word?" Silas stepped aside with him. The judge's voice lowered. "I heard tell there's been trouble in these parts. A man named Burke Harlan claims to own half the valley by right of purchase. Says he's missing some property." Silas's jaw tightened. "Harlan's claim ends where my door begins." Harmon studied him, then nodded. "That's what I suspected. If he shows his face, you send word. The law's thin out here, but it still stands." Silas tipped his hat. "Appreciate that, Judge." That night, they stayed at Mrs. Spey, Willoughby's boarding house, a widow who took one look at Jane and insisted on feeding her enough stew for two. Jane sat by the fire after Katrina fell asleep, her hands folded in her lap. The room smelled of wood smoke and bread. "You nervous?" Silas asked gently. She smiled faintly. "A little. It feels like a dream I'll wake from." He sat beside her, the light glinting off his wedding shirt folded over a chair. "It's no dream. It's a second chance. For both of us." She turned to look at him, her voice soft. "You think the Lord gives many?" "Only when he sees two people worth the trouble," he said with a half smile. She laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "Then we best not waste it." Silas reached over, taking her hand. "I've wasted too much already. Tomorrow, Jane, tomorrow I mean to begin again." The wedding took place under the open sky behind the boarding house, wildflowers at their feet, the judge's voice deep and sure as he read the vows. A few townsfolk gathered to witness, including Henry Powell and Mrs. Willoughby. Even the blacksmith came, his apron still dusted with soot. Jane's dress was simple, pale blue cotton, her hair braided with a ribbon. Silas wore his best shirt and freshly polished boots. Katrina cooed in her arms, a white bonnet tied beneath her chin. When Harmon asked, "Do you, Silas Jackson, take this woman?" the answer came low and firm, "With all I am." And when he asked Jane, her voice was steady. "I do." They joined hands. Harmon smiled, lifting his Bible toward the bright spring sky. "Then by the power vested in me by God and the laws of this territory, I pronounce you husband and wife." Applause rippled softly through the crowd. Jane laughed through her tears. Silas bent his head and kissed her, slowly, reverently, as though sealing not just a vow, but a lifetime of prayers answered. Even Katrina squealed with delight. Henry Powell dabbed his eyes with a handkerchief. "Praise be," he muttered. "If this don't prove the Lord still works miracles, nothing will." That night, after the festivities, Silas stepped outside into the cool air. The stars blazed above, sharp and countless. Behind him, Jane hummed softly to Katrina in the cradle, her voice gentle as falling snow. Silas bowed his head. "Lord," he murmured, "I thank you for what you've given me, more than I ever thought to ask for. Keep us safe from the darkness that still lingers, and give me the strength to protect what you've trusted me with." He lifted his gaze again, the stars reflected in his eyes. Peace was never permanent out here, but for that moment, under the wide western sky, it felt near enough to touch. It started with a chill wind blowing down from the high pass. The pines bent low, and the sky turned the color of pewter. By midday, even the miners were hurrying to cover their sluice boxes, muttering about rain and bad omens. Jane felt it first, not the weather, but the tension beneath it. Katrina was restless all morning, fussing in her cradle. Jane couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was drawing close. When Silas came in from the barn, his face was grim. Tracks again, up by the ridge. Her heart sank. "More riders?" He nodded. "3, maybe 4. They weren't hiding their trail this time." Jane's hands trembled as she lifted Katrina. "It's him, isn't it? Burke Harlan?" "I reckon it is." "What will you do?" Silas set his rifle on the table and began checking the chamber. "What I must." Jane caught his arm. "Silas, please, don't go meet him alone." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "I ain't looking for a fight, Jane, but I'll not let him take what the Lord's given me." She pressed her lips together, tears glinting. "Then at least let me pray over you first." He nodded, bowing his head as she laid her hand gently over his heart. Father, she whispered, you've carried us through hunger, snow, and fear. Carry him now through whatever lies ahead. Put your hand between him and harm, and if this is the hour you test us, give us the faith to stand and not fall. Silas opened his eyes. Amen. He kissed her forehead, his voice a low murmur. You've got a strength I've never seen before. She smiled faintly through her tears. I learned it from a stubborn miner who wouldn't let the cold take him. He chuckled softly, then turned toward the door. Bolt it after me. Keep the baby close. He rode hard up the ridge, wind biting his face, clouds gathering like dark wings overhead. The land that had seemed so welcoming in spring now looked wild again, the way it had the day he first found Jane in the snow. Near the crest he saw them, 4 riders, one holding a black hat low against the wind. Burke Harlan. Silas slowed his horse, stopping 20 yards away. Harlan dismounted first, stepping forward. He was dressed too fine for the wilderness, a long coat, polished boots, and a revolver that gleamed like silver. His face bore the arrogance of a man who thought money and cruelty made him powerful. Jackson, he drawled, you've caused me no small trouble. Silas stayed still, his voice calm. Can't say I'm sorry. Harlan's lip curled. That woman belongs to me. Her husband owed me money before he died. I took what was due. Silas's eyes hardened. You took nothing but another man's suffering and turned it into sin. You think God don't see that? God? Harlan sneered. Out here, the law of God's the man with the gun and the gold. Then you're poorer than you look. Harlan's hand twitched toward his revolver. I'll have the woman and the child. You can walk away if you've any sense. Silas's voice dropped low. I've buried one wife, Harlan. I'll not lose another soul I love. Something in his tone made the men behind Harlan stir uneasily. Even bullies could sense when a man meant every word. Harlan's eyes flicked toward them. You boys stand ready. I'll handle this. He turned back to Silas, grinning. I reckon you forgot what it means to lose everything. Silas's reply was quiet, almost a whisper. No, that's why I fight to keep what's left. The storm broke with the sound of thunder and gunfire. The first shot came from Harlan, striking Silas's horse in the flank. The animal reared, throwing Silas into the mud. He rolled, firing once. One of Harlan's men fell, clutching his leg. Rain began to pour, cold and heavy. The ridge turned slick. Silas crawled behind a boulder, reloading with shaking hands. Bullets struck the rock beside him, shards of stone slicing his cheek. He peered around just long enough to see Harlan advancing, pistol raised, expression wild. Then, suddenly a new sound cut through the storm, the thunder of another horse. Down the slope rode Henry Powell, coat flapping, rifle ready. Jackson, he shouted, you're not fighting this alone. Harlan spun, firing twice. Powell's horse stumbled, but the old man hit the ground running, taking cover beside Silas. You got away with trouble, son, Powell grunted. Never asked for it, Silas said, reloading, but I reckon God lets us meet the devils we're meant to drive off. Then, let's drive 'em. Together they fired, the sound echoing through the valley. Another of Harlan's men dropped his gun and fled into the trees. The last turned his horse and galloped away. That left Harlan alone. The rain slowed. Steam rose from the ground as Silas stepped out from cover, rifle steady. Drop it, he called. Harlan's laughter rang cold. You wouldn't shoot me, Jackson. You're a righteous man. Maybe, but I'll do what's needed to keep the innocent safe. Harlan raised his gun. Then you'll die trying. A single shot rang out. Harlan froze, eyes wide, then fell backward into the mud. His pistol clattered beside him. Powell lowered his rifle slowly, smoke curling from the barrel. Wasn't looking to do that, he said quietly, but you can't reason with a man who's already made his bargain with the devil. Silas stared at Harlan's still form for a long moment before bowing his head. May the Lord have mercy on him. Then softly, and thank you for sparing us again. By nightfall, the storm had passed. Jane waited by the window, Katrina asleep in her arms. When Silas and Powell rode up, muddy and weary but alive, she ran out into the rain-washed yard. Silas! He caught her as she threw herself into his arms. It's done, he said, voice rough. He won't trouble us again. She wept against his chest. I prayed every minute you were gone. I reckon those prayers carried me home, he said. Powell dismounted stiffly, tipping his hat. The good Lord answers the faithful, Mrs. Jackson, and I'd say he's got his hand on this family. Jane smiled through her tears. He surely does. That night, after the baby was fed and asleep, Jane and Silas sat by the fire. Neither spoke for a long while. The only sound was the quiet crackle of burning pine. At last, Jane whispered, "It's over now?" Silas nodded slowly. "As over as sin ever gets in this world." She reached for his hand. "Then let's live the life we prayed for, day by day as long as God lets us." He squeezed her fingers gently. "That's all I ever wanted." Outside, the rain began again, but softly this time, washing the valley clean. And in the quiet warmth of their little cabin, peace finally took root. The next morning broke with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural after the storm. The rain had washed the world clean. Mist clung to the ridges, and the river below the valley ran full and clear, glinting like glass. Silas woke early, though his body ached from the fight. He sat up in bed, careful not to wake Jane or the baby. For the first time in months, he could hear nothing but the gentle sounds of home, the pop of the dying fire, the slow rhythm of Katrina's breathing. Yet peace was not the same as ease. He rose quietly, pulling on his shirt, and stepped outside into the pale light. The ground was damp, the air sharp with pine and earth. Out by the barn stood Henry Powell, already tending to the horses. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Silas said as he approached. Powell chuckled. "Old bones get up before the sun, whether I like it or not. You?" "Couldn't rest." Silas glanced toward the hills. "Feels wrong somehow. After all that noise, the quiet." Powell nodded, his expression somber. "Storm leaves a hollow in a man's chest. Takes time for the Lord to fill it again." They worked in silence a while, mending a gate hinge and checking tack. Finally, Silas said quietly, "I keep seeing him fall. Harlan. Every time I close my eyes." "You didn't shoot him," Powell reminded gently. "No, but I'd have done it if you hadn't. I felt it in my bones." Powell wiped his hands on his coat. "There's a difference between justice and vengeance. One keeps a man upright, the other hollows him out. You didn't cross that line." Silas frowned. "Feels like I came close." "Then be grateful you had the sense to stop," Powell said. "The Lord don't fault a man for defending his home, Silas, but he does ask what you do with that afterward." That afterward came quicker than they expected. By noon, a small party rode up from Alder Creek, Judge Harmon among them, flanked by 2 deputies and a handful of townsmen. Jane was on the porch, rocking Katrina when she saw the riders. She set the baby inside and called for Silas. When the judge dismounted, his face was grave but not unkind. "Mr. Jackson," he said, "I heard word there was a killing." Silas stood straight, meeting his eyes. "There was." "Burke Harlan?" "Yes, sir." "Tell me how it happened." Silas recounted everything, the threats, the ambush, the storm. When he finished, Harmon was silent for a moment, studying the mud at his boots. "Powell," the judge said finally, turning toward the older man, "you're shot." Powell nodded. "Aimed for his arm, but the wind had its way. I'd testify to that before any jury, you please." "I don't doubt it," Harmon said. He took off his hat, rubbing the brim between his fingers. "Truth is, I expected something like this. Harlan's been riding roughshod over these hills too long. Still, law's law. I'll need to take a statement and record the death properly." Jane came to stand beside Silas, her eyes anxious. Will they take you away?" Harmon looked at her gently. "Ma'am, this territory's full of hard choices. The law don't exist to punish the innocent, but to remind men where mercy begins and ends." He sighed. "I'll write the report myself. I'll call it self-defense," which it was. "But Mr. Jackson?" "Yes, Judge? Don't let this make you hard. Too many men kill to survive and forget how to live after. You've got a family now. Let that be your labor from here on." Silas nodded slowly. "I'll do my best." "That's all any man can promise," Harmon said, then smiled faintly. "And since the good book says to owe no man anything but love, I reckon you and Mrs. Jackson are square with the world." He tipped his hat to Jane. "Congratulations again on your marriage, ma'am. I trust it'll be a peaceful one now." After the judge and his party departed, Jane sat on the porch steps, holding Katrina close as Silas joined her. The afternoon sun filtered through the clouds, lighting the valley in soft gold. She looked at him for a long while before speaking. "Do you ever think God means for us to fight our way to peace?" He considered the question. "I used to think peace was something a man found by running far enough, but maybe it's what's left when you stop running and choose to stay." Jane smiled faintly. "Then we'll stay, here, together." He nodded, gazing at the cabin, the hills, the tiny cradle by the window. "We'll make this place a home." That evening, as twilight fell, Silas walked down to the creek alone. The water was high, still carrying twigs and leaves from the storm. He crouched by the bank, dipping his hand into the icy current. Lord, he murmured, I don't understand why you chose me for this life, why you spared me when better men fell. But I thank you for Jane, for the child, for a chance to be more than what I was. He paused, listening to the water's steady rush, and for mercy, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that forgives. He rose, turning toward the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and through the window he could see Jane moving inside, her shadow cradling the baby. For the first time, he realized the ache in his chest, the one he'd carried since his first wife died, had eased, not vanished, but softened, as though God had reached in and traded grief for gratitude. Later, by the hearth, Jane sang softly to Katrina, an old hymn Silas hadn't heard in years. "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word." Her voice was low, warm, and full of peace. Silas closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. When she finished, she turned to him with a shy smile. "That was Mary's favorite hymn, my mother. She used to sing it when storms came." Silas's throat tightened. "It's a good one. Maybe we ought to keep singing it when the world gets loud again." Jane nodded. "We will. Together." The night stretched quiet and deep, filled with the soft crackle of fire and the faint murmur of prayer. And in that quiet, something shifted, a sense that their battle for survival had turned into something larger, a battle to build, to forgive, to believe that love could bloom again on scarred ground. For Silas Jackson and Jane, mercy had come not as a gift easily won, but as a calling they'd live out day by day, through work, through worship, through the tender rhythm of a family being born from ruin. By late August, the valley had ripened to gold. The wheat fields swayed like a sea under the morning sun, and the air hummed with grasshoppers and the far-off cry of hawks. The river had fallen back to its summer banks, and the sound of its waters had softened to a steady whisper, a lullaby for those who had learned to listen. The Jackson place looked different now. Where once the cabin stood alone in a rough patch of grass, now a corral stretched out to the south, a half-built barn to the east. Silas had added shutters to the windows, mended the porch rail, and planted a small garden that Jane tended faithfully. Katrina, chubby and laughing, had begun to crawl. Most mornings found her in the shade of the porch, tugging at dandelions while her mother knelt beside her, hands deep in the soil. "Careful now, little one," Jane said, lifting her daughter's hand away from a pebble. "That's not for Edie." Katrina cooed in protest, then broke into giggles as Silas came striding up from the pasture, his shirt open at the collar, hair damp with sweat. "Someone's fussin' again," he teased, leaning down to kiss the baby's forehead. "That sound like hunger or mischief, you think?" Jane smiled. "A bit of both, I'd wager." He grinned. "Takes after her mama, then." Jane swatted at him playfully, though her cheeks flushed pink. "And you'd best hush before she learns that kind of sass from you." He chuckled, settling beside them on the porch steps, resting his forearms on his knees. For a while, they simply sat there, the three of them, watching the morning unfold. It was strange how natural it felt, this quiet domestic rhythm. There had been no grand vows after their hurried marriage, no fine words spoken by the hearth, but every nail driven, every meal shared, every prayer whispered over the sleeping child had bound them tighter than any ceremony could. Later that night, Jane stood at the window watching the stars rise over the mountains. "Silas," she said softly, "do you think God really plans all this out? The losses, the roads, the meetings?" He stepped behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Maybe not the hurt, but maybe he makes use of it." Jane turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Then I suppose he's still making use of me." Silas smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And me right alongside you." She leaned into him, her voice no more than a whisper. "Then maybe the road ahead won't be so lonely." He kissed her temple. "Not so long as we keep walking it together." Outside, the wind stirred the wheat, whispering through the valley like a prayer. The mountains stood dark and steady under the silver light of the moon, ancient, watchful witnesses to a new kind of peace. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned low, casting a warm glow over the cradle, the tools by the hearth, and two souls who had learned that sometimes the greatest gold a man could ever find was not buried in the earth, but given into his keeping. The evenings had begun to shorten, the sun slipping behind the ridge a little earlier each day. A cool wind carried the scent of pine and rain, and the harvest fields whispered of the coming autumn. Silas was mending the gate when the dog began to bark, a low, warning growl that turned sharp as hoofbeats echoed from the trail. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and shaded his eyes toward the road. A rider was coming fast down the slope, hat pulled low, coat flapping. The stranger slowed as he neared the yard, dust rising around the horse's legs. Something about the way he sat the saddle, proud, practiced, stirred Silas's caution. Jane stepped out onto the porch, Katrina balanced on her hip. "Silas," she called softly. He moved toward her, his voice steady. "Stay there a moment." The rider halted, swinging down from the horse with the ease of long miles. He was tall and lean, the kind of man the frontier made, sunburnt, eyes sharp, coat worn smooth at the elbows. He removed his hat politely. "Evenin', friend," he said. "Name's Harlan Boone. I hope I'm not trespassing. Heard tell there was a woman by the name of Jane Arthur living near Alder Creek." Jane froze. The sound of her maiden name seemed to echo through the quiet yard. Silas felt her tense behind him. "What business you got with Mrs. Jackson?" Silas asked, his tone guarded. Boone glanced past him toward the porch, recognition dawning. "So it's true," he said softly. "Jane." Jane's lips parted, her color draining. "Harlan?" she whispered. The dog barked again, pacing between them. Boone held up a hand. "I don't mean trouble. I only come because I thought you might be dead." Silas's jaw tightened. "You knew her before?" Boone nodded slowly. "Back when her husband, God rest him, worked the Bitter Creek claim with me. When he passed, I went east to settle a few debts for her. Took longer than I meant. By the time I came back, word was she'd vanished." Jane swallowed hard. "There was nothing left for me there, Harlan. I didn't even know you were alive." Boone's expression softened. "Guess the Lord saw fit to cross our trails again." Silas stepped closer, studying the man's face. "You look rode hard, mister. You're welcome to water your horse, but we keep a quiet place here." Boone nodded. "I'll not overstay. Just wanted to bring something that belonged to her." From his coat pocket he drew a small leather pouch, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Jane gasped. "My mother's cross," she said, reaching out with trembling hands. "I thought it lost." Boone placed it gently in her palm. "Your husband gave it before he died. Told me to see it found its way back to you." Silas watched the exchange silently. Jane clutched the pouch to her chest, tears bright in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "You've done more kindness than I can say." Boone nodded, tipping his hat. "I only wish I'd come sooner." He looked toward the baby, curiosity flickering. "And this little one?" Jane drew Katrina closer. "Mine," she said simply. "Born not long after I left Bitter Creek." Boone smiled faintly. "She favors you." There was a long pause, the kind of silence heavy with unspoken questions. Then Silas cleared his throat. "You'll stay for supper at least." Boone hesitated, then nodded. "Obliged." Inside, the lamplight was warm, the air thick with the smell of stew and bread. Boone ate sparingly, his eyes flicking between them as if memorizing their faces. "I still can't rightly believe you're alive," he said. "When the storm hit that spring, I figured you lost with the rest." Jane's gaze dropped to her hands. "I near was, if not for Silas." Boone looked at the man beside her, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Seems you were God's answer to a prayer." Silas met his look evenly. "Maybe just a miner who knew how to dig through snow." Boone smiled slightly. Either way, the Lord's hand was in it. After supper, while Jane put Katrina to bed, the two men stepped outside. The moon hung low and pale over the ridge. Crickets sang in the grass. Boone drew a breath. "She's a strong woman. Always was. Deserved better than what she got." Silas nodded. "She's building a good life here. I aim to see she keeps it." Boone studied him. "Then I'll not interfere. Just thought she ought to know the past ain't been forgotten." He reached into his saddlebag and handed Silas a folded paper. "There's something else. Deed to the Bitter Creek claim. It was hers by right. I held it till I could find her again." Silas frowned, unfolding the document by the lantern light. "This worth much?" Boone shrugged. "Not for gold anymore. But there's timber. Maybe water rights. Whatever it brings, it's hers." Silas looked toward the cabin window where lamplight glowed softly. "You mean to say this is clean?" "As clean as the law can make it," Boone said. "I won't see her cheated again." They shook hands, rough palms meeting in the dim light. "Ride careful, Boone," Silas said quietly. The man smiled, mounting his horse. Take care of her, Jackson. She's walked through more storms than most. When Silas returned inside, Jane was standing by the cradle, eyes glistening. I heard you talking, she said. He brought the deed? Silas nodded, handing her the paper. It's yours, all of it. She looked down at the faded ink, then folded it carefully. It's strange. I thought that chapter was buried forever. Silas stepped close, his voice low. Sometimes the past rides back just to show us how far we've come. She smiled faintly, tears slipping down her cheeks. Then maybe the Lord sent Harlan to close a door, not open one. He brushed a thumb across her cheek. Reckon so. Katrina stirred in the cradle, sighing softly in her sleep. Jane looked down at her daughter, then back at Silas. I used to think salvation was a single moment, she whispered. Now I think it's 1,000 small mercies, like this one. Silas took her hand, his voice rough. Mercy's worth more than gold. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by the dark. And, for the first time since the storm that had brought her to him, Jane felt the past truly let go. Winter arrived quietly that year, with snow drifting down from the mountains like gray feathers. The valley grew hushed under its weight, and the river slowed to a murmur beneath ice along its edges. Inside the cabin, the hearth burned low but steady. Katrina slept snug in a woolen blanket, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm with the wind outside. Jane sat in the rocking chair beside her, a needle in her hand mending Silas's wool socks, the soft lamplight glinting off her hair. Silas stood by the window, eyes tracing the trail of the ridge. He had seen many winters in the mountains, many storms that threatened life itself, but this one carried a weight heavier than the snow. He could feel it in his bones, the reminder that peace was never permanent, even in a home filled with love. Jane glanced up. You're quiet tonight? He turned, resting his hands on the sill. Just thinking about all that's happened. She nodded slowly. The snow always reminds me life's fragile, yet it's still beautiful. Silas's jaw tightened. Aye, and sometimes fragile enough to break if you don't hold it right. She smiled faintly. We're holding it right, together. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. I've wondered, Jane, about the folks we've lost, my wife, your past. Sometimes I think the Lord lets the snow cover it all so we can see the path ahead more clearly. Jane's lips trembled. I pray he does, for Katrina, for us, and for the rest of them. The next morning, the valley was blanketed in deep white. Snowflakes clung to the pines, and each breath they drew left a mist in the crisp air. Silas, bundled in furs, led a horse toward the ridge, while Jane filled the cabin with warmth and the smell of simmering stew. By evening, Silas returned. His face was flushed, hands raw from the cold, but his eyes held the same quiet fire they always had. Storm's worse than it looks, he said, shaking snow from his coat. But the barn's sturdy enough, roof won't collapse. Jane crossed to him, placing a hand on his arm. You take care, or the snow will take you first. He smiled faintly. I reckon God sent me back in one piece this time. She leaned into him, whispering, And I thank him. Katrina squealed from her cradle, breaking the tension, and Silas chuckled. The three of them moved closer to the fire, sharing warmth, food, and the quiet laughter that only a home in the mountains could bring. That night, Silas knelt by the hearth, Jane beside him, Katrina tucked between them. Hands clasped, eyes closed, they offered thanks. Lord, we've known storms, snow, and fear, yet you have kept us together. Forgive the hearts that err and guide us to kindness. Bless our family, our home, and the valley we call ours. Let mercy live in our hearts as long as the snow falls and the rivers run. When they opened their eyes, Silas looked at Jane, and she at him. No words were needed. The snow outside might cover the earth in white, but their hearts were warm with the knowledge that forgiveness, love, and faith had built a life no storm could ever wash away. Katrina stirred, yawning, and Silas whispered, We made it, little one, together. Jane smiled, brushing a kiss across Silas's cheek. Yes, together, always. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, but inside, the cabin glowed with the soft warmth of home, prayer, and the quiet, steadfast heartbeat of family. The snow had melted entirely from the valley, leaving the earth dark and fertile beneath a fresh mantle of green. Streams gurgled with the runoff, carrying the promise of a new season, and the sun hung warmer in the sky, lighting the mountains with gold. Silas stood at the edge of the field, surveying the crops he had planted months before. Wheat and barley peeked through the soil, promising harvests if God continued to favor their work. He ran a hand over the damp earth, feeling its cool texture beneath his fingers, and let out a deep breath. "Spring suits you," Jane said from behind, carrying Katrina in her arms. He turned, smiling, taking in the sight of her wrapped in a shawl, the baby nestled against her chest. "It suits all of us." Katrina squealed at the sight of him and stretched her arms, prompting Silas to kneel and catch her with a laugh. "You'll be climbing the ridge before I know it," he teased, holding her at arm's length. Jane laughed softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "And I suppose I should be chasing after her by then." Like they moved together down the path toward the cabin, the warmth of the sun on their backs and the scent of new growth filling the air. Birds sang from the trees, and the gentle rustle of leaves whispered of life reborn. Inside the cabin, the hearth burned low, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the earthy scent of the valley. Jane placed Katrina in the cradle while Silas hung a basket of herbs above the fire to dry. "Do you remember," Jane began, sitting on the floor beside the baby, "the first winter we spent here, when the snow lay thick and the wind rattled the roof?" Silas chuckled. "I remember thinking we'd either freeze or be buried alive." Jane smiled softly. "And now look at us, warm, fed, alive, and stronger than ever." He knelt beside her, brushing a thumb across Katrina's cheek. "Stronger because we trusted each other, and because we trusted him." Jane nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "Faith carried us, and love kept us." Days passed, and the valley came alive with work. Silas and Jane rebuilt the fence along the northern pasture, planted new seeds in the garden, and tended the barn. Katrina learned to crawl over the soft earth, laughing as the dog chased her tiny hands. One afternoon, a group of neighbors came by, farmers and ranchers from nearby homesteads. They had heard of the Jackson family's survival through snow, storm, and threat, and now came to share seeds, tools, and friendly counsel. Jane welcomed them, pouring cider into tin cups and handing bread from the table. Silas greeted each man with a firm handshake, respect shining in his eyes. By sunset, laughter and conversation filled the yard, a stark contrast to the quiet tension that had once hovered over the cabin. Here was the life they had fought for: community, safety, and the blessing of shared labor. That evening, Jane and Silas sat on the porch, Katrina nestled between them. The sky blazed with pink and gold, and the mountains seemed to glow with promise. "I think," Jane said softly, "this is the first spring I've felt truly at peace since everything happened." Silas wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Me too. God's mercy has been steady, even when we thought the world would tear us apart." Jane leaned into him. "I know the storms aren't gone forever, but I also know we're ready for whatever comes." Silas pressed a kiss to her temple. "And together, we'll face it. Always." Katrina gurgled, reaching for Silas's hand. He picked her up, spinning her gently as Jane laughed. The sound of joy mingled with the soft evening breeze, filling the cabin and yard with warmth. Night fell, and the family settled by the hearth. Silas and Jane knelt together, hands clasped over Katrina. "Lord," Silas prayed, "thank you for every trial, every storm, and every blessing. We've seen the weight of sorrow and the height of fear, but you've brought us here to hope, to love, and to life. Bless this family, this home, and all who pass through these mountains. Keep our hearts strong and our faith steady." Jane added softly, "And let mercy guide us as it has guided our path to this place." Katrina yawned and snuggled closer, the quiet of the cabin a balm against the cold night outside. Silas looked around, the cabin, the valley beyond, the warm light on Jane's face, and for the first time, he felt a peace that was complete. Not because the past was forgotten, not because danger would never return, but because they had built something stronger than fear, stronger than grief, a family bound by love, faith, and the promise of new beginnings. Outside, the stars shone over Alder Creek, reflecting off the gentle river and the fields ready for harvest. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the quiet, steady heartbeat of a world made new. And in that moment, Silas Jackson knew the future was theirs to shape, the past forgiven, and the life they had earned together was more precious than all the gold in the mountains. Spring had fully claimed the valley. The snow that had once weighed heavy on the mountains and filled the riverbanks with ice was gone, replaced by soft green meadows and the cheerful chatter of birds returning from their winter travels. Silas Jackson stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, eyes tracing the hills that had once seemed so cruel and lonely. The cabin behind him glowed warmly in the afternoon sun. Smoke rose in gentle spirals from the chimney, carrying the comforting scent of fresh bread and herbs from the garden. Katrina toddled across the yard, her small feet leaving prints in the soft earth, and Jane followed, laughing as the baby's joy filled the air. Silas's heart swelled with a sense of peace he had never known, a deep, quiet gratitude for the life they had fought to claim. It had not been easy. The snowstorm that had brought Jane to him, the threats of men like Harlan, the bitter cold and nights of hunger, all of it was behind them now. What remained was hope, faith, and a family bound together by love. Jane approached, carrying Katrina, and placed the child into Silas's arms. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her tiny body and the steady pulse of life that had survived against every odds. "She's grown strong," Jane said softly, her hand resting on Silas's arm, "just like her father." Silas smiled, brushing a kiss across Katrina's forehead. "Stronger than either of us could have imagined." They stood together on the porch, watching the river sparkle in the sunlight, the fields stretching green and fertile around them. Birds sang overhead. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh soil, and for the first time since the storm, the world felt perfectly right. Later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky with pink and gold, Jane and Silas knelt together in the cabin, hands joined over Katrina, offering thanks. "Lord," Silas whispered, "you brought us through snow and fear, loss and despair. You brought us here to love and life. May we honor your mercy and keep faith strong all our days." Jane added softly, "And let our hearts always carry the light of your grace, so that even in the coldest winters, we remember the warmth of your love." Katrina yawned, curling into her father's chest. Outside, the stars began to shine, faintly at first, then brighter, illuminating Alder Creek like a blanket of hope. Silas gazed out at the mountains, the valley, and his family, and for the first time since he had lost his first wife, he felt the world settle around him with certainty and peace. The past was forgiven, the storms behind them, and the future stretched before them, full of promise, love, and the enduring light of God's mercy. Together, they watched the night deepen, the river's gentle song carrying the quiet truth of their lives, that sometimes the greatest treasures of all are not gold or silver, but a home, a family, and the steadfast grace of love that carries through every storm. Here on Wild Mercy, we don't just tell tales, we bring forgotten hearts back to life. Love that defies distance, war, and fate. Hit that like button to keep these stories riding strong. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss another heartfelt romance, a story of resilience, and where love always finds a way home.